I don't mean to brag. I don't care, but I want you to know double vaxxed, booster, flu shot, and I'm going to be honest, I have the shingle shot too. And I still get my period. What? Yes. Traveled.
Woman
Went to
comedian
Mexico
talking about her
twice.
vagina. That's fresh.
Did shows, meet and greets. Never got COVID. Clearly, Jesus loves me the most. Seriously. So nice.
He heard
so
that.
Nice. I don't brag.
Everyone thinks it's part of the bit.
I know.
Yeah, all things considered, I mean,
laughing right when she hit her head.
I got to give her props. I mean, this is like the funniest female stand-up act I've ever seen. So
yeah,
I'm gonna give
could replace Amy Schumer. They've probably got that empty block now on Comedy Central, so you got to put it in laughs. There. It could have been like Hicks used to do that bit about. He said Chicago, -25, little nippy, but it's kind of fun going out in that while they're watching smokers pass out because they don't know when they're done exhaling, and then he does the frat fall and everything. Like it looked like a legit frat fall, but she slammed her head, man.
Yeah,
that was rough.
Yeah. Do you think
you know if she's okay?
Well, yeah. So by the way, that was Heather McDonald. I had to at least figure out what her name was before I showed this because so I don't.
Isn't she like a legit touring act? That name is familiar to me.
I have no idea. I'd never heard of her before, but
okay.
Yeah, apparently she knocked her head. She knocked her head and she got a skull fracture.
Oh shit!
So she was hospitalized and she was okay. But God, I really wonder, like, was she conscious when she heard everybody laughing at her, like falling and hitting her head?
No,
you can see her like kind of moving there.
When she lost most of control,
thought was
she
like,
was out.
I'm killing.
Nailed
do you
it.
think it was? Do you think it was like in Always Sunny? Do you think it was Always Sunny where like she kind of has a hallucination that she's like rocking the house and being like super funny, and the next thing she knows, there's people standing over her like, Heather.
She's got to figure out a way to like put that in the bit now in the act because she found like a great tag for that bit. Like, where was that bit gonna go? There's no way it has a better closer than that.
Yeah, she's gonna go to every club now, and people are gonna be shouting like, "Do the fall,
just fall,
do the fall."
She's gonna have like a little concussion counter. The doctor's like, I can only do this bit 4 more times before I have to quit.
It's like when Homer Simpson joins Lollapalooza and the doctor tells him, like, you can't keep shooting yourself like cannonballs every day.
Yeah, you do this again, you'll die.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, dude. So Connor Freeman, welcome back, man.
This is all right, thank you. Great to be back.
Let me tell you, man, my liberal friends, they've had a lot of people that they've really cared deeply about. They cared a lot about the kids in cages for about 10 minutes. They cared about the Kurds for about 2 minutes. They cared about the Afghani women. And now they care deeply about the Ukrainians.
Sure.
So now they're very concerned about the Ukrainians. What's going on with the Ukrainians?
Well, so, I mean, essentially, the idea is that Russia is preparing an invasion force, and they've talked a lot about how they have, more than 100,000 troops up on their border, and that they're preparing for an invasion, and that, Ukraine is imperiled. The late thing that, I mean, especially that, this has been going on since November, that these U.S. claims that there's going to be in fact, when they initially started all this, Ukraine, like at the beginning of November, they were saying that Russia is preparing to invade, and the Ukrainians came out and said, "What? What are you talking about? We don't see that." And then, I think a week or two later, they finally were like, "Oh, right, yeah, the invasion. Yeah, absolutely. That's what we're scared of too." But because they play along for the first, especially for the first couple of months of this, the Ukrainians, Zelensky and Kiev were playing along and hyping up the threat and saying you should impose sanctions now and all this kind of thing, because it provides them a lot more, particularly military aid. I think last year we gave hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid to Ukraine under Biden. Armed patrol boats and more of these Javelin anti-tank missiles. Trump is the one who really escalated the military aid to Ukraine. Obama was afraid to do that.
Let's go back in time even further. Because, America, they have this amazing, and stupid Nick has got camera trouble again. they've got this amazing ability to pretend like history started whenever
Right.
they say it did. And so suddenly, people who never even said the word Ukraine in their life, now suddenly they're very, very concerned about what's going on in Ukraine. And it's all just because of big bad Putin. And that's, so let's
Right.
go back. Let's go
Yeah.
back even further.
Okay.
When would you say this began?
I mean, honestly, it's really the post-Cold War policy that's anti-Russia. So really what
There
you're
we
talking
go.
about is, at the end of the Cold War, when
I
the
wanna do
Warsaw
it.
Pact,
Let's do
when
it
the
all.
war,
Let's do it all.
when the Warsaw Pact is dissolved and the Soviet Union, is basically shut down, and the Soviet republics get their independence, and the Russians want to integrate, with the West. What happens is the Americans make a promise to George Bush and James Baker, as Secretary of State. This is Bush 1. Make a promise to Gorbachev, with the West German Chancellor, that if NATO is allowed to basically get Germany, if Germany reunifies under NATO and the Russian troops leave, that we'll never expand NATO 1 inch to the east. And that promise was reaffirmed multiple times by not just the Americans and the Germans, but also the French and the British. And so, I mean, that was why Russia agreed to all this. And then there's a whole much more ugly history that follows that, because the Americans, the Harvard boys, Larry Summers, and these kinds of guys initiated the shock therapy, privatization on economic policies in Russia, where they liquidated everything. They did loans for shares and voucher schemes, and basically handed everything off, all these formerly state-owned enterprises, to Russian oligarchs. And
yeah, I'm sorry. I'm gonna pause real quick because
Sure.
this actually came out recently. Let me translate this to English. I'm gonna share this. So I kind of thought we already knew this, but you touched on it. You touched on the promise that if I think this is this is it right here. So archive find confirms Russian view of NATO's eastward expansion. So I thought we already knew this, but just a few days ago, this kind of broke, where I guess they found this archive of like a promise. The the West violated promises made in 1990 with NATO's eastward expansion. So like what you're saying is, I thought it was already fact, but now it's like super fact again because it's coming out again. So this German website's reporting this, that they found these documents where, the U.S. was saying, or the Russians rather were saying, we're not going to fight the German reunification, and you can add Germany into NATO, which is this massive concession. But if you're going to do this, then you have to promise not to expand NATO anywhere east past Germany, right? Is that what we're just talking about? Yeah. So, so that's big, right? Because
of course, yeah.
So,
a lot of this had already been. I mean, that's more evidence, and it's it's, of course, it's abundant. There's also documents released at the George Washington University National Security Archive a few years ago that showed that they did put this in writing. Not that it was like a treaty or anything, which is what sort of the Clintonians and the Cold War Russia hawks will always point out, that like, well, it wasn't in writing, and then it turns out that it was, and they go, well, it wasn't a treaty. So, but even if it was a treaty, it wouldn't have made a difference. We walk out on treaties unilaterally all the time.
Yeah.
And
the point is they have a legit grievance,
for sure. And so what happened was, I trace this back primarily to before. I'll just say they decimated the Russian economy. It was on the scale of like 3 Great Depressions. Inflation, it was worse than the American Great Depression. They had over by the mid 90s, like 1 million excess deaths in just people in deaths of despair, suicides, homicides, alcoholism, heart attacks. People were just devastated. Life expectancy went down by double digits, and they basically handed off all these, like I said, these formerly state-owned enterprises to oligarchs and like favorite American sort of handpicked oligarchs. And what happened also is that you saw just a complete breakdown in the society. And Russia, and of course we rigged the election to get Yeltsin reelected, and he basically, for all intents and purposes, he even blockaded the parliament at one point. He was just governing by diktat, and they eventually, I think, even shelled the parliament building, and it was just absolutely horrible what the American empire did to Russia. Scott Horton often says, or in one of the speeches he gave at the Mises Institute, that it was the economic equivalent of dropping a couple of nukes on them, like the worst kind of sore winner policy. Sort of akin to you could think of it like Afghanistan, like we're in this case, we're the sore losers waging this brutal economic war against those Afghan girls you mentioned earlier that we were always supposed to get up in arms about, when there was ever a threat of a U.S. withdrawal. But now that we're gone and we don't like the fact that we lost to the Taliban, we're threatening to kill probably 1 million people with these, by withholding all this, their assets. Yeah. And the aid won't really necessarily, that's not going to really fix the problem because for the economic collapse that's coming or that's already starting, that, it's a real liquidity crisis and they need the actual money in their banks. But anyway, so after that, I really trace this back primarily to the Defense Planning Guidance of 1992, because Dick Cheney, after the first Iraq War, Dick Cheney asked Paul Wolfowitz and Zalmay Khalilzad, these notorious neoconservatives, to draw up essentially a national security strategy for the rest of the 20th century, the 90s going into the new millennium. And they say in there that basically they're going to increase spending across the board, particularly on air and naval forces, double down and issue security guarantees to former Warsaw Pact states, build up new alliances in Latin America and East Asia. And they're going to look, to fight wars in theaters previously unexplored, and put all kinds of money into missiles and missile programs and missile defense and these sorts of things. And so this was rescinded after it was leaked to the New York Times. But Cheney was very happy with it. In fact, there's a quote of him saying, I believe to Khalilzad, that, congratulations, you found a new reason for our role in the world, or a new justification, something like that, which it is, because, we're supposed to have this big peace dividend, and this is an argument for global empire. And so but by the time Junior became president, Scooter Libby rewrote it, and it became the national security strategy. Yeah, but before Bush becomes president, Clinton is already enlarging NATO and walking back this promise. So by 1999, they're adding in Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary. And NATO has launched wars in Serbia and in Kosovo. And so, the new Cold War, you could argue, had already started at that point, for sure. And then by the time George W. Bush is president, after 9/11 happens, Putin offers him, he's, I believe, the first world leader that called up Bush and offered his condolences and his assistance. And I think they offered them an Axis route. I think they call it the Northern Route through the Central Asian states north of Afghanistan. Like our old supply routes, you can use this since you're going to be going into Afghanistan. And Bush's response was to rip up the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And I believe put missiles and radars in Poland, and you know what? I'm getting that part a little bit off. I don't want to say anything that isn't true. But what happened was, after that, let's put it this way: they put more and more military equipment in Eastern Europe, and then by 2004, they're enlarging NATO to Slovakia. They added like 7 countries. Yeah, it was the Baltic states.
Bush went nuts.
I like this map that we have on the screen here. It really shows how we've really been marching towards.
Yeah. So let me clarify. So Bush Sr. was the one who made the deal.
That's right.
But then Clinton, the one who took over, like right after that, like the next president, just ripped that up, just completely ignored it.
Mm-hmm.
And then Bush Jr. just completely ruins Bush Sr.'s, I guess, promise completely, and just goes nuts and adds, was it Latvia,
Slovenia, Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Yeah. And then Obama added 2 more. He did Croatia, Albania. Trump added North Macedonia and Montenegro. And And Biden hasn't so far done it, but I mean, they made a promise that they'd bring Georgia and Ukraine in 2008, and
Hey,
Lavrov famously told the ambassador, "That's a red line for us. Net means net."
Niet means niet.
Yeah,
Hey, Freeman, have you ever played a Civ?
no, it's a
Civ, like the computer game, you know?
Oh,
on-
Sims?
Civilization. Have you
no,
played?
no, I haven't.
So it's it's like this randomly generated world, and you have all these players who have these nations, right?
Yeah.
And there's all these city states and stuff, and computers play all the different nations. And if you start to make alliances with like countries that are close to where the other like nations are, they get really pissed off at you for doing that. So
Yeah, of
anyway,
course.
for anybody listening, if you want to understand what's going on, just understand like with what Civ, like that's what we're doing to the Russians right now, and that's what we've been doing since I
Right.
guess since before 1990, but we just never stopped doing it.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, what's really interesting is there's a thing called the Committee to Expand NATO, and it was set up by Bruce Jackson, who is a former vice president and executive at Lockheed Martin, who was a former military intelligence
coincidence.
officer and all kinds of and it was the neocons and also Madeleine Albright, so the liberal interventionists, and they're kind of more and more kind of indistinguishable in a lot of ways. Biden and Obama have neocons in their administration. Trump certainly did, and obviously everybody knows George W. Bush's neocon problem. But on the board of that group was John McCain, Madeleine Albright, Condoleezza Rice, Paul Wolfowitz, Robert Kagan, Richard Pearl, and this is in the mid 90s. And so it was really, NATO expansion in many ways, it's, ostensibly to contain Russia and protect Europe from attack and this kind of thing. But in the modern era, it's largely a corporate welfare scheme for the military industrial complex. It just threatens to really start a global war, which otherwise, especially in this region, if America wasn't involved, especially when they try and get in the way of things like Nord Stream 2, which I think has a lot to do with this crisis. The fear that Russia and Germany become greater trading partners and become more and more interdependent, because already Europe depends on Russian gas for, believe about a third of its natural gas supply. And then Germany, it's more than 50%. So there's one of the reasons why Germany has been a moderating influence on all this, aggression toward Russia, because, they want that pipeline. It's kind of tied up in their regulatory bureaucracy right now. But once the approval goes through, they would love to get it going, because otherwise they're going to face an energy crisis. But there's,
they've scuttled all their nuclear plants.
Yeah. So they, it's very important to them. And they've also, the Germans and the French have been against this idea of bringing Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. The French and the Germans told Bush and Obama no. And as you can see now, especially since they were involved in kind of after the U.S. coup in Kiev in 2014, where they actually used real Nazis in a street putsch who were integrated into the National Guard. It's one of the major problems, because you have hundreds of thousands of they have approximately, I think their Russians are saying 120,000 Ukrainian forces on the contact line with the Donbass. And there is fear, especially the separatists are warning that there's going to be an escalation and offensive into the heart of those breakaway republics. And if that does happen, then it's possible that the war will start, not necessarily because of a Russian invasion, but because of the information war and the way things are going. Biden and his administration have already crafted a narrative that virtually any escalation there will be blamed on Russia, because they're calling everything a false flag. But I'll just say that
finish up real quick. I want to kind of go back and get back to kind of where we were.
Sure.
So we kind of discussed the history of NATO expansion, and now, if you look at this map that we showed, Ukraine is just this, by the way, if you don't know where Ukraine is, it's that big country just east of Germany. It's gray right there. And and Crimea is that little peninsula down to the south there. So what happened so I think things really started moving quickly when Obama was president, right? There was a coup. Mm-hmm. Is that right? With Yanukovych? Let's talk about what happened there.
Well, there was
Who is first of all a little bit on who Yanukovych is, if you have anything about him, and then what happened.
Yeah. Well, Yanukovych was democratically elected leader of Ukraine who had been overthrown in the Orange Revolution in 2004 by the U.S. government and then returned to power years later. And he's described as being pro-Russian. Oh, by the way, I mean, that's the other thing, too, is like his election.
Yeah, let's talk about that. That's big. Don't gloss over that. So in 2004, let's start there. You said there was like the Yanukovych, he got in, and then what happened?
The Americans were launching color-coded revolutions throughout that region. In Georgia in 2003, they put Saakashvili in power. They took out Yanukovych in 2004. There were efforts to do the same thing in Tajikistan as well, in more in Central Asia, and there were efforts to even do this in Belarus, I believe, that failed. And these are kind of like George Soros style, I should say, NED style, sort of the old school like CIA coups are done by these kind of non-governmental organizations. In fact, they were trying to do the same thing in Belarus again recently. They still are. They have I forget what her name is, but it's kind of a sort of a. Basically they have these people that they prop up through these different institutions, and they flood these in Ukraine, for instance. It worked. They poured billions of dollars into it in this NED coup, and then back these protesters. And it was essentially, the problem was in 2014 anyway, which I know more about that. This is an association agreement where the EU, backed by Washington, was basically telling Ukraine, you have to choose, like, do you want to economically ally with us and take our association agreement, or you can work with Russia? And Putin said, and as his population was evenly split on this, and Putin came along and said, well, you can work with the EU and you can work with us. Like, we don't need any exclusivity. Yeah.
To Yanukovych.
Yeah. There's no need for this exclusivity. And we'll give you, billions of dollars. And there was all this kind of, he was offering them essentially a better deal. And the Americans, the Germans were already starting this coup to get them to take the EU deal. And I guess they were taking too long on it. And so they basically, Victoria Nuland, who's Robert Kagan's wife, was the Secretary of State or Assistant Secretary of State for Eurasian and European Affairs. Got heavily involved in this with people like John McCain, and they gave these protesters cover. And like I said, they're pouring billions of dollars in there, and a lot of violence broke out. Of course, they were backing the ultra-nationalist, sort of anti-Russian factions, and they basically, like I said, I mean, they overthrew Yanukovych and it was caught on a phone call, actually, that was intercepted by the Russians. That's the famous one, the FDEU call.
It appears to be a hacked phone conversation between top US officials about Ukraine, in which the EU is dismissed in crude terms, has been posted on the internet. The comments are attributed to the US Assistant Secretary of State Karen Nuland, who met President Yanukovych and opposition leaders separately in Kiev on Thursday.
Karen, another one.
The date and precise context of the recording are not known. Nuland and the US ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, discuss which of the country's opposition leaders they'd like to see in government, and they refer to getting the UN involved.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it, and, the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it.
The video has a transcript in Russian. The US State Department.
Okay, so
First of all,
so the story, according to the media, was U.S. official says dirty word, on a phone call. What do we do about profanity in the workplace? Am I right about that? That's how they kind of spun the whole story. But there's something else really important going on during that phone call, wasn't it?
Yeah, she was handpicking who would be the next president, Yatsenyuk, and she goes, Yats is the guy. And she says this to Jeffrey Pyatt, who's the American ambassador to Ukraine. And she talks about how I've spoken to Sullivan, who at that time is Biden's national security advisor, deputy national security advisor, but he's his national security advisor now. But she goes, I spoke to Sullivan. Sullivan's going to get the vice president to glue the deets together and to give everybody involved the attaboy on a conference call here soon, and
So it
we'll
was a
get this
coup.
all sewn up. Yeah.
It was a coup. The Russians.
They said that the
busted
Germans
them.
were taking too long and basically fuck them. So we're going to midwife this thing, and they went ahead and did it. And what happened was, since then, we've given I think it's at this point might even be a little bit more, but $2.7 billion in military aid to Kiev. And it's just a fascist government that's been killing its own people. I mean, we talk about that with like the enemies of the empire, and you go, "Oh, Assad's killing his own people." Well, they're actually killing their own people. I mean, somewhere between 10 and 15,000 people have died in this war since 2014, and they launched a war on terrorism on the east because the Donetsk and the Luhansk, the Donbass region, these ethnic Russians refused to accept the legitimacy of the coup government, who are trying to ban the Russian language. And of course, like I said, there's this big Nazi problem. And of course, it's always been very divided there between West and East Ukraine. The East are more, ethnic Russians, and the West hate Russians. And so it was a powder keg, although it's become very lucrative as a way of sort of painting the Russian, I mean, this is especially when the Russian aggression mantra starts to really build up, and it's been a big boon for the military industrial complex and to kind of justify these new Cold War policies. And then you add in Russiagate and everything. So
if okay, go ahead.
I would say that's good context, because most people don't understand like the social interaction between Russia and Ukraine. The average American's like, well, they're both Slavic countries. Why aren't they buddy? But there really is an East-West divide in this country, where half the country literally just wants to be part of Russia. The other half's like, no, we're Ukraine. But
Western Ukraine wasn't a part of. Western Ukraine used to be a part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and only became a part of Ukraine a little before World War II. And then, of course, when the Nazis invaded, many of the Western Ukrainians allied with them. And so a lot of these like Azov battalion guys and the sort of Nazis in this, as a part of they're in law enforcement, they're in, like I said, the National Guard, security forces. A lot of these guys are like the grandsons of the Galatian SS.
Yeah. So let's talk about them real quick. So, so the U.S. took a policy at that point. Well, first let's wrap this up. Before we get there, I want to talk about the Nazis, but Yanukovych flees to Russia because he was just put in such a position where like he couldn't win, and so I guess to save his own skin, he kind of fled to Russia. Or did he say he was being threatened? Why did he leave?
Well, he was even offering new elections that they wouldn't accept. That it was getting very violent.
Okay,
and things were getting out of control, and that's when I believe 3 former Ukrainian presidents signed a letter saying that they should go ahead and retake Crimea. And that's when, because after the end of the Cold War, they had their Sevastopol base on lease, and the Russians had, and that had held for the longest time. But once it was threatened, it was bloodless. But the Russians seized Crimea, which had been a part of Russia virtually since before the Constitution was ratified.
And they did it because they caught the United States trying to add Ukraine into NATO. Like their suspicions were confirmed, and the U.S. was doing it so brazenly.
You had people bragging about it too in the media.
Yeah.
As Scott Horton always points out, Gideon Rose, who I think was like the editor of Foreign Affairs, went on the Stephen Colbert show and said, it's like we're stealing Robin away from Batman, and we're stealing Russia's girlfriend and all this stuff. And they go, he's distracted with the Sochi Olympics, so he's not going to be able to do anything about it.
Game. It's just a game.
Well, if you listen to Victoria Nuland on that call, it's very, they're married. She's married to Robert Kagan. These people are like, it's essentially the worst war hawks in our society.
Yeah, and no one knows who they are, but they're just like company men. Like, it's so weird.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Crimea is it's strategically important to Russia, more than just being, historically a part of Russia. It's also a very important naval base.
That's right.
Like it's in Russia's best interest to make sure that's secured for them.
I've heard this quote attributed to Brzezinski before, that he said, well, if you take that away from them, they go from not even really being they're not even really a regional power. It's it's one of their main abilities to project power is from having that year-round warm water base, that port. And but yeah, so they did that, and then the war in the East, once that got started, the Russians sent deniable clandestine forces to help the Lufthansa People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic maintain their autonomy. And this is the worst bits of the war. Most of those 10 to 15,000 people got killed in 2014.
But when did this start? I'm sorry, like when did this?
Oh, 2014 and 2015.
Okay, so
that's the coup is in February of 2014.
After what we're talking about, after Yanukovych flees the country?
No, this is all, that would be, he's overthrown in February.
He's overthrown. So who replaced him? Who ended up replacing him?
Yatsenyuk, and then I believe Poroshenko.
Okay, and then who were they allied with? Like who?
It's backed by the U.S. And
so the U.S. actually gets their man in there.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay,
and then Zelensky is obviously, he's the president now, and he sort of ran on a peace platform, but he's been, one of the reasons why he's become more hawkish is because Poroshenko has been attacking him from the right. And that's also one of the reasons why. One of the things that Kiev did after the coup as well is basically ban opposition parties. I mean, I believe they've charged Poroshenko with treason for buying coal from the Donbass, but they also did this to the former leader of I believe his name Medvedchuk, of the former leader of the Eastern bloc. And so they've also shut down the communist parties, the leftist parties, TV stations, opposition media. It's been pretty insane, the takeover there. And most of even the numbers, Ted Snyder has written about this, even the numbers that are when they conduct surveys of people in Ukraine who want, do you want to join NATO? And it's put to them like that. It's like 40%. It's a minority. And those numbers are even smaller because they don't include the East. They don't include.
Okay. So
that whole population.
So is that what the violence really is the East side of Ukraine not liking the fact that the U.S. just put that, like the Western powers, I guess they see the Western powers as taking over. So who are we funding?
Government buildings and refuse to recognize. Yeah,
so
and
who are we funding? Like who are the rebels that we're funding?
Oh, these are those like, for instance, like the Azov battalion. Those people participated in the street putsch and a lot of the violence in the streets, and they're the brown shirts essentially. But they were brought in to the National Guard. They're a part of the security forces now officially and in law enforcement. And but
okay, that's okay. So that was kind of confusing me. Like if the U.S. actually got their man in there, then who are the Nazis? Who are we funding? Who are these people we're hearing about the U.S. funding?
Yeah, well, I mean now, they also commit violence in the West, but I mean primarily the security forces and the military of Ukraine is being built up, you could say, to take over the rest of the country, because that's what's been going. That's what they have wanted to do. In fact, all last year they talk about the Crimean platform and these kinds of things. They would have meetings with some of their Baltic NATO allies and the Turks and talk about retaking Crimea, retaking the Donbass. And this is where you get all this kind of cute rhetoric from people like Secretary Blinken, who say, we're committed to the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. It's like, and they keep the door open to NATO when you've already got Russian troops there. So if that's obviously one of the main things, I mean, let alone Putin's concerns, if you did bring Ukraine to NATO, which is not going to happen because you need unanimous consent from all the other NATO member states, according to the UN Charter. And also they're engaged in a border crisis right now. And all the corruption. There's a bunch of reasons why Ukraine won't be brought in. But if they were, and we knew when Biden and Blinken came into the White House, they've been vocal proponents of doing this for decades since it was put forward.
You mentioned maintaining the border sovereign, or the border as it is established for Ukraine. Yeah. Who originally drew that border? Was that the USSR post World War II? Like who smashed this country together in this form?
Well, the borders have been shifted around. I should learn more about, especially Ukrainian history, but it's largely been it was changed by Lenin, Stalin,
Mhm.
Khrushchev, and it's like I said, they formed before World War II is not even part. West Ukraine was not even a part of the country, and
Right.
it's so. But as far as, I mean, this is sort of the post Cold War borders. And
Yeah,
it's kind
okay.
of remained the way it has now since 1991. But like I said, there was an agreement about Crimea. Now that's part of the Russian Federation, but that was.
But that's not recognized by the world yet, right?
By Google, Lord Google.
Yeah, I mean the
Isn't that
Americans
amazing?
don't accept. They call it an illegal occupation and this sort of thing. But of course,
I-
the Crimeans voted by super majorities to be annexed by the Russians, and that's been confirmed by outside Western polling firms multiple times. On the other hand, the interesting thing too is everybody says that Putin wants to take the Donbass, or he wants to invade Ukraine to take the Donbass, but he could have done that really at any points in the last 7 years, and they voted in a referendum. As you know, in Crimea, they did vote for that referendum, and it was annexed, and that, I mean, that happened.
Well,
after
the Russians rig every election with their super
There you go.
hacker.
Even Americans,
Guccifer 2.0 rigs every election, right?
Right.
Worldwide.
To your point, if they wanted
but
to
he said no to
invade,
the
they
EU
could have.
when they asked to join the Russian Federation. He said no, and that's why it's. I'll just say really quick. That's a major thing. Is like there's a lot of reasons why he doesn't necessarily want that. It would be a lot of trouble, and also he can influence Ukrainian politics more if it's a part of Ukraine.
Yeah.
Which is why this whole thing about recognizing the Donbass republics, that might happen. The Duma has asked him to do. They passed a resolution asking or saying it's up to Putin to do this, but it remains to be seen if he'll do that. I mean, for a while now, and especially in the last couple of months, the Kremlin's position has been, nope, we support the Minsk II agreements. We want autonomy and a ceasefire. We're working it out with the Russians. We're working out with the Germans and the French. Kiev is not abiding by Minsk, but we remain committed to it. So.
Got it. So yeah, to your point, they could have invaded any time in the past 7 years or so and taken this if they wanted to. So why now? It's like, if to me, it felt like it came out of the blue.
Yeah.
That tensions are boiling over on the border, and they do have their troops lined up there. I mean, it is Russia's border, so like they can have their troops there if they want. But what sparked this to become an issue again?
Well,
in the global spotlight.
Yeah, sure. I think honestly, if it was all okay. So at the end of 2020, Stars and Stripes put out a piece where they said, we just because of the pandemic, we weren't able to have our warships in the Black Sea enough all year. We're only there for like 82 days. And we've really got to ramp that up. And the NATO Hawks and the anti-Russia Hawks are saying the same thing. Like, we really got to step it up in the Black Sea. So it just came out toward the end of last year that they spent 182 days in the Black Sea last year, U.S. warships. And you had, there were all kinds of provocations. So there's a great piece I recommend everybody read called The Danger of Great Power Competition by my friend Patrick McFarland from the Libertarian Institute. And he goes through because they were conducting, there was the big one was called Defender Europe 21. But NATO and the U.S. held the largest exercises since the Cold War era on Russia's borders last year, all throughout Eastern Europe. Every branch. You had Russian and German tanks, I believe in Latvia, racing each other very close to the border.
Just think of how powerful we are. Like, the United States can operate troops on Russia's border on behalf of this organization that was created to defeat them. Russia can't even move troops in their own country without getting shit from everybody.
Right. That's literally what's happening. I think Hillary Clinton has a quote about they're moving troops around on NATO's border. Yeah, they're insane.
They are so powerful.
Our sphere of influence is the whole. Yeah, this is it. I really recommend everybody check this out. He goes through the whole. He highlights there's exercises called Crystal Arrow 21 and Defender Europe, and if you scroll through, you'll see a lot of these quotes, even from the Russians, talking about hundreds of thousands of troops. Let's see. Is this Sergei Shoigu? Yeah, see, here he is talking about Defender Europe. 31,000 soldiers from 27 nations. Yeah, this went on for months. And let's see. Poland, the Baltic states. let's see. Yeah, so the U.S. Army,
America's
the Air
such an
Force, Naval
asshole.
Special Operations Forces. I apologize. I was looking for the number of troops. They originally, it was just anyway. This went on all year. These exercises. You had bombers flying in over the Black Sea that often get intercepted by Russian fighter jets. And we were sending more military aid to Ukraine. Escalating that as well at the same time. And a lot of these drills were taking place in Ukraine. So, and Ukraine was participating in these, and a lot of them were going on in the Black Sea.
So
and
we're freaking out about Russian tanks on their border, but it's only because we've been having our tanks on their border first.
Yeah, there it is. As regards to the launching of the Crystal Arrow exercise on March 23rd, the NATO report waxed lively. U.S. Abrams tanks joined German Leopard tanks to race across the open field, marking the start of an 8-day exercise on the Adazai military training area, Latvia.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
military training area.
Yeah. And this went on, like I said, all year. I mean, Biden massively ramped up the military presence in the Asia Pacific and the South China Sea, the Yellow Sea, and the East China Sea. There was like 2,000 sorties, warplanes and spy planes by the end of the year last year. And they escalated. He nearly doubled the number of aircraft carrier strike groups that were sent to the South China Sea. So all this escalation with Russia and China ramped up this past year under Biden. And I think, honestly, it was largely they wanted to make this point. I think they basically just jumped the shark because Putin has had long concerns. Basically, Biden came in and extended New START, which put strategic limits on limits on strategically deployed nuclear weapons in both states, Russia and the United States. So these are submarine launched nuclear missiles,
right.
And the
that
bombers.
Treaty was set to expire, right?
That's right.
Okay.
And Trump probably would have let it expire. I've heard some people dispute that, but I mean, he left the INF treaty and he left open skies. So the only one left was New START. And there were threats that they would just let it expire. In fact, they were dragging their feet on negotiations about it because I believe his arms control envoy was a guy named Marshall Billingsley, who was just basically making the whole thing about, well, if China's not going to get involved, then we're not going to talk. And the Chinese are like, we have a few hundred nuclear weapons. You both have approximately 6,000. So like what, so they said, the Chinese position is mostly been, especially when this has come up in the last couple of years, is so if you both reduce your arsenals, then yeah, we'd be glad to talk. But the Americans and the Russians don't do that for a lot of reasons. I think it's, it's very unfortunate. But the Americans also have a $1 trillion+ program that's going to go on for 30 years. It was started by Obama to revamp the entire nuclear arsenal. The factories and everything to rebuild the nuclear, I forget how they describe it, but rebuild the nuclear triad or modernize the nuclear triad and all this stuff. So New START puts limits on. Yeah, exactly.
Are we still flying B-52s on like a 24/7 basis around the world just in case we need to blow everyone up?
Well, there's a lot of flights still going all over the place. I mean, I'll say we just flew a nuclear
weapon close calls. What do you think, Nick?
That'd be a good one.
Let's do that. All right. Sorry, Freeman.
Well, yeah, no, you know what though? I'll tell you what. Right before all this went down in November, they simulated a nuke. So I suppose they started making these claims at the beginning of November, but in that month, the U.S. simulated a nuclear attack on Russia with multiple strategic bombers 12.4 miles off of Russia's border. And Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, came out and said, hey, this is not a joke. This is really serious and this is insane. And also he goes, he said that they had escalated the bomber flights in Russia's near, I want to say he said in Russia's near broader in the Black Sea quite a bit that month. And I actually have the number here. One second.
It's like, if you think of how much like of a close call the Cuban Missile Crisis was, there being Russian nukes in Cuba, like, fuck, we got them at their front door.
That's a good parallel to what's going on right now. Do you think of how bad the U.S. flipped out when Russia was caught doing stuff in Cuba?
Right, and we had missiles in Turkey, and
now we're doing the same goddamn thing.
Yeah, we'll take them out, but don't say anything because we'll look like pussies. And that's a big problem too with American politics because Biden Biden, I don't know what's going on. Everybody kind of knows that the guy's half dead, so it's very scary when you're relying on Joe
Yeah.
Biden and Anthony Blinken to be.
They give him a shot every morning and say,
Right.
yeah,
I hope
get
it's
out, sign this.
right before the talks with Putin, because otherwise, yeah, he'll fall asleep or something. But Blinken, Blinken's one of the worst hawks. I mean, he helped
Who are we
lie us
talking
into Iraq.
Who are
What
we
was
talking
that?
about? Who?
Secretary of State, but he's Blinken is Biden's right-hand man on foreign policy.
Okay.
He's been his top foreign policy aide for decades, and he helped lie America into the Iraq war when Biden was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. They held a bunch of phony expert hearings.
Okay.
And they helped whip the opposition party into supporting it in the Senate. But then he helped engineer the wars in Syria and Libya and Yemen. Even when the war in Yemen got started, there's a quote from him when I think he was working in the State Department at the time. It was like a deputy secretary of state or something. He came out and said, "We've bolstered intelligence sharing and weapons sales to the Saudis." Yeah, so he's a really bad guy, and he's been extremely hawkish on Russia this whole time. And China as well. And so, I mean, in this year, Biden's administration, this whole framing of this, Biden, so when Trump, his national security strategy was great power competition with Russia and China. And this is, after Bush's, like we discussed, that whole basically unipolar moment national security strategy. So then Biden comes in and gives this whole thing in April where he goes, it's autocracies versus democracy. And that's what this whole century is about. And we have to win the 21st century. We're in extreme competition with China, and Russia is an autocrat who, Putin's a brutal autocrat who fears democracy. And it's us, the democracies, Saudi Arabia and Israel versus Russia and China and the other bad guys. And so there's just been this massive military ramp up. And so Putin, I should say, if you listen to Ray McGovern, who is the former the chief of the Soviet division of analysts at the CIA, worked in the CIA for 30 years. He used to be George H.W. Bush's briefer during the Reagan administration. And he runs veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity and writes at antiwar.com. And he's been I've been reading him to stay sane throughout all this. I love reading him anyway, but he's been the most moderating, don't worry, there's not going to be an invasion kind of voice on this stuff the whole time. And what he uses Kremlinology, like they used to do in the CIA, because they realized, I think he's quoted even Bill Casey saying that we can learn a lot by looking at what they say in TASS and Pravda, like what the Russian officials and leaders are actually saying. And if you read a lot, been some interesting developments. So Putin's main concerns here, chiefly, are the anti-ballistic missile sites in Romania and Poland and the threat of moving them to Ukraine, or putting the same kind of anti-ballistic missile sites in Ukraine. And the problem with that is they call them anti-ballistic missiles, but they're actually they're fired out of they're called MK-41 launchers, missile launchers, and they can be retrofit to fit Tomahawk cruise missiles that you can tip with H bombs. So it's a massive threat to Russia, to their ICBM, strategic force. It tries to cancel out. The whole point of ripping up the ABM treaty is to try, which lasted about 30 years. In fact, Ray McGovern was involved in all that, the whole trust but verify regime, etc. The whole point is to try and cancel out mutually assured destruction. And that's one of the reasons why Russia started to revamp their nuclear program and look at hypersonics and things like this. And a few years ago, he announced all these new, nuclear weapons that they had and delivery vehicles and kinds of things. And so, but America really started this arms race, and then they walked out on the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which banned, short range and medium range missiles in the region. And they claimed that Russia had built some short-range missiles. That may be true, but it was more on their frontier with China. And, the reason America left, too, is because they want to deploy those kind of medium-range missiles around China themselves. So
has the treaty governing nukes in space expired?
I believe New START is the only one left. I'm not exactly sure about that, to be honest with you.
Okay, I'll see if I can Google something.
Yeah, so Putin's main concern are those anti-ballistic missile sites, and he wants to see a rollback of NATO troops and nuclear forces from all these NATO. He wants to see a rollback of NATO troops and weapons from the former Soviet republics and Warsaw Pact states. He wants to have transparency on all these military drills in Europe and near Russia. On both, he'll say on both sides.
And Vermont. They want Vermont.
Yeah,
What do you
exactly.
think? We could probably lose Vermont, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Just give it
I
to
remember
him.
Louis C.K. asked Donald Rumsfeld, "Would you trade Texas for France or whatever it was?"
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, when he asked if he was a lizard.
Yeah, that's right. On
That
Opie
was what
Anthony.
it was about. Yeah.
So it's the 1987 Outer Space Treaty, and it has no expiration date. So that's a plus.
Yeah, absolutely. And so and that's another thing too. Like you got to wonder, like they're building up Space Force as well, and talking about even
what are we up to?
Yeah, exactly.
They get their own Space Force.
Yeah,
Dude,
and it's
awesome.
just it
If I was
poses
going to
such.
join the military, it'd be Space Force.
Yeah, why not, right?
Hands
I mean,
down.
you might as well if that's going to be. It'd be like being in Moonraker, the James Bond movie. Like that looks pretty cool.
I was thinking more Star Trek, but
yeah,
I guess Moonraker would be good too.
But I'll, so they want. I mean, these are.
Let's answer this question. What alternatives does Russia have?
Okay, so that's the thing. The Americans. So Biden has been holding calls with Putin about this, and if you read Ray McGovern, he talks about the Russians came out, I believe, after the December 30th phone call before, so they waited until the Russian holidays for these high-level official talks between the U.S. and Russia, and also the Russia and NATO, and the readout of the Russian readout of the calls said that Biden assured him that we will not be putting offensive missiles in Ukraine. Now, also, there were reports I believe in the beginning of December from the AP where they were speaking to U.S. officials who were saying, we've told Kiev that Ukraine NATO membership, that's not happening for at least 10 years, which basically means it's not going to happen. And then Biden said in his big presser that was kind of out of control, he said, I believe after being pressed by David Sanger, the awful New York Times reporter, but nevertheless, he got an answer from him that I don't intend to Ukraine won't be joining NATO in any near term. It's not likely. Now, to the thing about the missiles, so that's going to be they have discussed in the U.S. responses and the NATO response, but it's the U.S. response I'm referring to here. They talk about mutual transparency measures, inspections on those sites that would ensure that there are no Tomahawks there. And I think they should just be removed. But that is the offer. And then in exchange, the Americans want to access to Russian missile sites that they can have inspections on. And so that's one way, certainly. And like I said, a lot of the most dangerous thing about Ukraine here with the crisis is I don't think Putin will invade Ukraine. Here's the major thing. They're now evacuating hundreds of thousands of people from the Donbass. The Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic have ordered evacuation. They're going to southern Russia, Rostov, and places like this. And the Russians are going to be providing for them and providing them shelter and these sorts of things. But and I believe also some money as well for these refugees. But the main thing here is we just took we had a contingent of more than 100 National Guard troops from Florida in Ukraine. We've had special operations forces there since 2015, and likewise CIA paramilitaries. And the CIA paramilitaries, according to this Yahoo News report that came out in January, I think, it said that they've been there for 7 years. We trained the Ukrainian forces at a secret base in the southern United States, and we're very close to the contact line and have helped make gains. And that some of the people who were interviewed, they're all anonymous, said, someone said it's not like we're training an insurgency, but then other people said, yeah, it is. And we've been training them how to kill Russians. And then you had Stavridis, I believe is how you pronounce his name, former NATO Secretary General in the New York Times, I wrote a piece called Cold War Served Hot that has all these quotes. And the guy is saying in the New York Times, yeah, remember Afghanistan in the 80s? We're going to make that look puny by comparison for what we have in store for Russia. And then they said that Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Lloyd Austin the Pentagon chief spoke to their Russian counterparts and said, yeah, if there's any kind of an invasion, the Pentagon will overtly back an insurgency, and the CIA will back it covertly. And this is all in the New York Times.
Right.
They're openly saying, like, come on, like, we want a proxy war. And also this whole buildup on the other side of the contact line, the Russian buildup on the Ukrainian border is not really a Russian buildup on the Ukrainian border. Even the troops in Belarus, I think they're drawing down now because the exercises are supposed to end today, and they may be doing more exercises. I'm not sure yet. I'll have to look at the news tomorrow, but they're supposed to be pulling them back. But they had 30,000 troops, and some of them were about, these drills were taking place in 80 kilometers from Kiev. So all of this, I would argue, is essentially Putin putting in place. They call them military technical measures, which is a Russian way of saying all options are on the table.
Well, but but doesn't them
Sure.
doing military exercises right by Kiev, like openly in front of everybody, isn't that a real good sign that they're not going to do it? Because I mean, if they were actually going to storm it, and actually invade, they wouldn't try to warn anybody about. Like, they wouldn't want anyone to know it was
Be a
about to happen.
surprise.
Yeah. I think it's they call it. They're sort of. I was listening to Mark Sloboda talk about this, and he said that they're sort of putting themselves in the position for a decapitation strike, because they're that close to Kiev. But honestly, I think you're right, because what it is it's saying, look, we could do this.
Yeah, but we're not. It's maneuvering. It's like leverage they're basically negotiating, and they're trying to get leverage.
Yeah,
Also,
absolutely. That's what all this is. That's why they have troops. They're all those bases in Western Russia are at least 100 miles away from the Ukraine border. And one of them is much closer to Belarus. And then obviously they've reinforced Crimea. They're saying that they're withdrawing some troops from Crimea and those Western Russian bases. The Americans and NATO are disputing that. They put out a video that showed them crossing the Crimean Bridge, and the Americans called it propaganda. But they're also saying that I forget which Russian official it was that came out and said, this might have been a couple, but they said, hey, the buildup or whatever for our exercises, moving these troops in, that took weeks and weeks. So these things don't happen overnight. And they go, just more unfounded accusations. But the U.S. has been saying all this stuff about honestly, I think the Americans in large part, and this has been admitted. Glenn Greenwald put out a tweet of a conference for the Atlantic Council where a former MI6 chief is talking about how, a lot of these intelligence sources say claims in the media. He goes, this isn't like real great intelligence or anything. I forget how he described it. He's like, this is part of an information war. And so he tried to paint it like, we're not going to let Putin have his way where he tries to manipulate us with his propaganda in the media. We're going to do it back to him.
Isn't that the video we just saw in the last episode? Isn't that what he's talking about, Nick?
The one where Ned Price was like, I'm giving you the evidence right now.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was with Matt Lee. This is a different video.
One. Okay.
I can find that. But I just read it in a piece last night.
It sounds a lot like it.
I have a question. Is there any, to me, it sounds like the U.S. is saying they're going to invade everyone. Look out. Russia's about to invade. Isn't there a strategic value in putting a pie in America's face and then just by not invading?
I think so. I think it's going to really have an effect on the American people and on the West. Colonel Doug McGregor, who was top senior advisor to Christopher Miller, the acting Secretary of Defense at the end of Trump's administration. He's always on the Tucker Carlson show. And he's, highly decorated, but anti-interventionist, colonel. And he says, a retired colonel, and I think he writes for the American Conservative quite a bit. Actually, he does. And he said that this might be the end of NATO. He goes, because Putin has called Biden's bluff and showed NATO, and Scott Ritter, I believe, is saying the same stuff, that they've really revealed NATO to be impotent. He goes, Doug McGregor said on Sky News, there's a great interview of him where he's talking about, I heard Dan McAdams talk about this on the Liberty Report, because he said McGregor had sent him an email saying that, look, they just got briefings in Washington, like Biden and the principals and in NATO, that you can't fight a war with Russia in Eastern Europe. They have an integrated air defense from the Gulf of Finland to the Black Sea. They can deny any threat from that region. And months, like maybe last month, I shouldn't say months, but it feels like this has been going on for whatever. We almost lose track of time with all this. But Gilbert Doctorow was talking about how they were moving Ixlander missiles into the theater, which can hit, highly precise, highly destructive strikes in Kiev. The Russians have brought in S-400 air defenses, which could deny, basically all this military aid that's coming into Ukraine from the Americans and the British. They can shut that down whenever they want. And he talks about they were doing, major drills in the Black Sea with these landing craft and these sorts of things. So the Russians have put in, like I said, they call them these military technical measures, but that's exactly what it is. All this is about leverage. The Iranians ramp up their nuclear program and they build advanced centrifuges and they increase the enrichment of, uranium like hexafluoride to 60% so that they can get and we seem to be getting closer and closer to a deal. And in fact, they ramped up their enrichment program early on, which led to the JCPOA. It wasn't the sanctions. But Russia doesn't fear these sanctions. Now, the thing is the Americans, I think, are looking for, or certain elements in America and the NATO establishment and the intelligence community and NATO want this proxy war to start so they can cut off Nord Stream 2 and sanction Russia and cut them off from the world and impose.
And didn't Biden pretty much say yesterday he'd blow up Nord Stream?
Well, he said with the German chancellor, he might have said that the other day, but when he was speaking to reporters. But the thing I'm thinking of is when he recently with Olaf Scholz, the new German chancellor, who's been pretty good on this issue for the most part, and he said, if Russia invades Ukraine, there will be no Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it, or I will bring an end to it. And he goes,
to me, that means one thing.
Right. And he goes, ain't that right, Olaf Scholz? And Olaf Scholz goes, the NATO would be unified, and the steps that we would take would be the mutual steps. And it's he wouldn't say Nord Stream 2. He didn't say, so he can always say, like, I didn't agree to any of that. Like, so they're playing a delicate sort of dance here. The French, Macron just had a meeting with Putin, and they're talking about working toward a ceasefire and continuing the Normandy format talks, which they recently just held the second ones in the last month. In the last month in Berlin, and there was no progress made. But it sounds like this meeting could, because the last time Macron spoke to Putin, Putin said that Macron, what he had laid out to him, could be the foundation for a real resolution to this crisis. So what I think we're seeing is, initially I thought Biden was kind of, some of this is a little, you have to sort of like read into it. I always sort of shrugged when I heard people say like Trump's fighting the deep state and this kind of thing. And I don't think that's what Biden's doing either. But I do think that Biden, at least in the things that he was saying to Putin, I think that Biden was less hawkish than other people in his administration, and certainly the Congress, and certainly, the military industrial complex and the media. So I think he was offering things to Putin because he's the one initially who said to Putin, you should put down your concerns on paper and we'll talk about it, like the security proposals, because they held some talks that made whatever Putin told Biden realized that, we'll talk whenever we get to talk about this very soon. And they both,
after my nap.
Yeah, exactly. They both they're in the middle of the call. And he's like, okay, hold on. I got to go take a nap. I'll be right back. But so they apparently were both Putin and Biden were quite influential on the substance of these talks, who they were sending for the talks. I think that
just like that,
he's been better on this than I would have expected, because he came in with this. He's traditionally been a horrible, horrible Russia hawk. They say ran the coup from the White House in 2014 in Kiev. I mean, he's a real hawk. It's one of the reasons why Hunter Biden got that job at Burisma. So there's a lot of
an experienced businessman, and they really needed him on the board.
Well, yeah. I mean, have you ever seen that video of
crack.
him? Yeah, I was gonna say, God, that video of juxtaposed of Biden's drug war speeches from the 80s and 90s, crossed with Hunter smoking crack, watching it.
I love that video.
One of the most effective anti-government libertarian ad campaigns I've ever seen. The Libertarian Party
They don't give a
should
fuck
run
anymore,
that
man.
as a commercial. I would do that.
They
So-
don't give a fuck anymore.
I know.
So the U.S. is crying wolf. That's how I interpret all this. So like
Yeah,
you're
but I
saying
think that they could start. I think that so there have been hundreds of explosions reported by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and Thursday and
Mhm.
Friday we'll learn more about what's been going on since, as the news comes out more in the early part of this week. But I mean, I was seeing videos as early as Wednesday night of mortars going off, not like actual videos that I could see, but I saw people filming, in neighborhoods in the east, and you can hear the mortars going off, and it's terrifying. And so the leaders of the Donetsk say that Kiev armed forces, armed with NATO and American weapons, are getting ready to launch a major offensive on the east. And the way the American narrative works at this point is, I mean, they've been really pushing it. Like every day they go, it's going to be an invasion. It's going to be the 16th. It was supposed to happen today. Or at least it's like now, maybe today, right? I mean, they said like after the 20th, then the 16th, it's going to be the 16th. Then there was another day where they said it was going to be at like 3:00. You've had Antony Blinken went to the Security Council and said basically stuff that we've done. Like he goes, yeah, well, they're going to like fake a chemical attack, false flag, and use that as a justification.
They're going to get
bomb
crisis
Kiev.
actors.
Yeah, they said that.
Each day, it still hasn't happened. So, like, at what point is it this was all manufactured in BS, or does this go hot? And
well, it all depends on what. I think it all depends. I think it's very clear that Putin doesn't want. I think Putin, like we said, I think this is for him. This is about the negotiations. This is about Russia's security, and Russia's security does not benefit unless he's forced to invade Ukraine. But that country is the size of Texas, and that would be a bloody insurgency that would go on for years and years and years and years. And the U.S. would pour weapons in there and would attempt to isolate them from the world. I think Russia has a few tricks up its sleeve for moving further east and dealing with Russia and countries like, Venezuela and Iran and all these other countries that are under sanctions. I think a lot of countries that are facing economic war from the U.S. are thinking about countermeasures that they can take to build a parallel system. And once you've got Russia and China pushed together like this by this incoherent American policy, which I think is largely the fault of the neocons, because the Cold War hawks, as bad as they were, would try and balance one against the other. That does not seem to be the strategy anymore. Although Ray McGovern says that Biden has become, and his team are now aware of this, but they weren't even aware of it by June of last year. Biden, after his first summit with Putin, came out and said, you're being squeezed by China, and it. They have the largest, they want to be the most strong military in the world and the strongest economy in the world, and you're threatened by them on their borders. And Putin apparently was
Your
like,
vodka's better.
yeah. And so, but they've been getting closer and closer together. The Chinese, the Xi Jinping has said that Putin and he have a partnership that exceeds an alliance in its closeness and warmness and all this kind of stuff. And they've opposed together AUKUS in the Pacific. The Chinese oppose NATO expansion, and they support these talks with the Germans and the French. And they talked about at the UN this past week how America's Cold War mentality is what's destabilizing all the world, and that you keep trying to build. You can't build security by muscling up these military blocks, these Cold War style blocks. And he goes, and it's not just in Europe where they're doing this. This is the Chinese envoy to the UN. He goes, it's not just Europe where this is happening, because that's what we're doing in the Pacific too. I mean, there's all these, the Quad, there's AUKUS now, and they're destabilizing the non-proliferation regime there, by providing nuclear submarines and that kind of technology to Australia. And
the old shit.
Yeah, I mean, probably, yeah. And it's just they finally may be realizing that if they pick a fight with one, they're gonna have to fight the other, because basically the Russians and the Chinese, I mean, for all intents and purposes, seem to have committed to defend each other's core interests, which is how they put it. Or they will come to each, they will support each other to defend their core interests. Yeah. It's
you throw Iran in there, and you basically got the what was the
Axis of
the
evil.
Axis, yeah, the tripartite pact or whatever, the triumvirate.
Right. And they just Iran does all this. They sell a lot of oil still to China, and the Americans go, well, we should sanction that. Like, what the Chinese don't care.
Yeah,
They're not gonna.
gotta be a country between the two.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't let Iran come between us. But it's very I mean, mainly that's the thing. We've built up we have such bad relations with Russia that they have done this, and basically, like I said, like McGregor said, they've called their bluff. They have they can strike he says they can strike any target in Western Europe that they choose to if there's a crisis. It's just the Americans don't have the air defenses. They don't have the ground troops. They don't have. It would take a year to build up an effective force for this. But then again, you have NATO coming out and going, Stoltenberg and Austin talking about how we're going to build new battle groups in Southeastern and Central and Eastern Europe and send more troops to Bulgaria and Romania and all these other Eastern European countries on Russia's part. In fact, Stoltenberg came out and said, he goes, if Russia wants less troops less NATO in Eastern Europe, then guess what they are going to get? More NATO in Eastern Europe. It's like there's a lot of institutional, obviously pushback against any move toward diplomacy. And McGovern says like that's one of the reasons why the part where there seems to be the most promise for a diplomatic solution, is on the issue of arms control, missile placement, restoring the INF treaty, and these kind of transparency measures, but particularly the missile stuff and the arms control. And that's one of the reasons why he says, we might not hear about it, but if it's going on quietly, and that's probably to the good, because that's one of the things is, as he says, he calls it Mickey Matt, the Military Industrial Congressional Intelligence Media Academia Think Tank Complex. And I mean, that's really I think a better way of describing the deep state. But he says Mickey Matt. It's a much
I like that.
Complex term. But he says, that they are, and he's right. I mean, they're so powerful that, could you imagine Biden did kind of let it slip at one of these conferences recently where he goes, NATO does not have any offensive strike weapons in Ukraine, and nor does America. We don't have any plans to. Neither of us do. And I was impressed to see that, just because previously, when they said that in the Russian readout of that call I told you about from December 30th, Jake Sullivan was asked, like, so what happened on the phone call? Like, why'd you guys talk days away from the talks in Geneva? What sprung this? What came out of it? And Jake Sullivan, they were just like, was there anything, notable that came out of the discussion between Putin and Biden? And Sullivan was just like, no, not really. Nothing to report. So they kept it close to their vest. But, it's very weird, because now Biden is saying he knows that Putin is going to invade. He's convinced that Putin's going to invade. He says we have significant intelligence capability that tells us. And obviously, I think, Sullivan and Blinken have been running around all over the place saying that there's going to be a major attack, and that they're going to attack Kiev, a city of 2.8 million people.
It's almost like he's giving red meat to all of the, just like the power structure or the company. Like, they got their hands on it. It's like, we got to give them something. We obviously don't want war to break out. So we're going to act like one's going to break out so we can make sure all of our buddies get paid. They get their money so they get off our backs. But we single-handedly, as long as these two guys talking on the phone don't want the war to happen, then it won't. Unless there's an accident.
That's our best hope right now, because there has to be.
It's just like Kennedy. It's just kind of like, it seems to be like a pattern right now where it's just the war dogs, like, all they want to do is go to war and fight each other. But just like the actual people who get the keys, like, they're the ones with the weight of what actually is behind it. And so they don't do it. It's like, it's like that scene in Dark Knight where they're on the boat. And, they're like, why don't you pull the trigger? Why don't you twist the thing and blow up the other boat? Like, why don't you do it? Like, and then he finally takes it, and it's like, okay, now you have to do it. And he can't do it.
Right.
Remember that?
Yeah, well, I think this actually happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis. An American destroyer wouldn't let a Russian submarine rise up to the above the water to get some air, and the Russian commanders, there were three of them, and they had to decide the vote basically on what do we do? Do we launch a nuclear torpedo, like because we're threatened here? And I think 2 out of the 3 said yes, and 1 said no, and so according to their rules, that then you have to have unanimous consent, so we're not doing
a ton
it.
of those.
Yeah,
I'm telling
lot
you,
of near
nuclear
misses,
weapon close calls.
One dude with a level head stopped nuclear war.
And the
that happened
Ukrainians,
multiple times.
yeah, and I'll just say the Ukrainians, as far as all this goes, I think they're also going to start, and they are already actually. I mean, Zelensky said over the weekend he wants to speak with Putin and find a solution to this crisis. And the Ukrainians and the Russians have been basically making jokes about the Americans. Zelensky said something about, it's the 16th. Is that invasion day? Well, we'll all hold hands. It'll be a day of unity, and we'll wear yellow and blue flags and everything. And everybody in the media go, he said it's going to be the 16th. He agrees. And he goes, they came out and they said, no, it's a joke. And the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK came out recently and said, hey, if, we can drop our desire. We don't have to join NATO if this is going to cause this much of a problem, and we can end this crisis by just saying we don't want to join. Then maybe we don't want to join. And then that got walked back by Zelensky and some of his other officials. But I think just them saying it is really notable. And also the Russians,
a good sign too.
Yeah, because also on top of that, he's saying he wants to talk to Putin. The main thing too is they need to get them to abide by the Minsk agreements and provide autonomy and have a real ceasefire, which the violence has significantly reduced since 2014 and 2015, since that deal was signed in 2016. But obviously, they refuse to provide. They haven't followed through on the autonomy, and there's still been ceasefire violations, hundreds just this week alone. So they have to implement that. Now, the thing is that Ukraine is the poorest country in Europe, and they exist basically on IMF welfare. So the Americans, it would be tough because of all the ultra nationalist forces. I think Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said, look, they've got 100 at the time. I think he said 120,000 troops on the contact line, and Kiev does not control the majority of those forces. So I would say that's kind of the main concern. But assuming Kiev, like they could launch an attack, and that certain elements in the CIA and NATO establishment and the Russia hawks, people like Nuland maybe would be like, yeah, this is our moment. Let's cut Nord Stream 2. And Robert Menendez, the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a Democrat who's an arch hawk on everything, on Iran, on Russia, and he said that he calls it they call his bill the mother of all sanctions bill. It's called the Defending Ukraine Sovereignty Act. There's a couple of them. I think that's the one that is his, and it would basically sanction Russian banks, Russian-owned enterprises. It would shut off Nord Stream 2. Russian oil, and so basically they're talking about cutting off Russian companies from trading in American and British pounds. The British were just talking about this recently, and so there's this major push to try and completely cut off Russia and launch a massive economic war against them. And so there's a lot of factions that I think want this to happen. I heard Joe Loria make a point. I'll say this. I was just reading today. Joe Loria said that it's possible that maybe the worst hawks, because Biden seems to be getting more hawkish, although they did say that Biden will be speaking with Putin soon here, because Blinken and Lavrov are having a meeting on Thursday. And they said after that, it was just announced today, an hour ago, or 2 hours ago, that they plan to, if there is no Russian invasion, then Putin and Biden will speak again or have a meeting. And but I'll just say that Loria was saying maybe the hawks who are in Biden's ear right now with all this hyperbolic rhetoric, it's going to happen after the 20th. I know it. They're getting ready for an invasion of Kiev. They're going to do it. Maybe they know something about what the forces that are poised to launch this offensive against the East are when they're going to launch their offensive. Because regardless of who starts it, Russia's going to get blamed. They're already saying like it's going to be a disinformation campaign. They're going to try and blame Ukraine for their invasion. But there's hundreds of thousands. I don't know how many have been evacuated at this point. I think they want the Donbass. The leader of the Donetsk said that they want to get 700,000 people out of there. But
that's what makes me pessimistic.
Yeah, there's hundreds of thousands of Russians in eastern Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens. And if they get attacked, he has to defend them. And if they're trying to leave now, I mean, maybe there is an effort to launch an offensive before they get, because it's also possible that they may be they're saying they're prioritizing getting the women, the children, and the elderly out first. And so maybe they leave behind, the militias and their deniable forces, right, to fight it off. And to fight off the Ukrainians as much as they can. And I don't know how long that'll last or how long it'll stay that contained. But Gilbert Doctorow made this point, and it's just a little, I mean, he didn't say like he had evidence of this necessarily, but it's something to think about. It's also possible that the Russians have been, having double agents providing intelligence to the media or providing to the American intelligence community, because as he pointed out, when the Russians came into Syria in 2015 and started doing the airstrikes and things, they made a deal with the Iraqis because they have a joint Iraqi-Russian intelligence unit that completely under the noses of the American embassy in Baghdad. The Americans had no idea. So they got overflight access and they went into Syria. So he made the point that all these claims about, we know what Russia's doing and it's going to be the 16th at 1:00 and they're going to shut off the what they say, the woman from the Atlantic Council or the Eurasia Center said, she put out some crazy tweet I can find for you, but it was like they're gonna kill the general staff and knock out the Air Force and the Navy and use a cyber attack to shut down all the key utilities, and then they're gonna install a pro-Russian president, and then they're gonna, if that doesn't work, they'll invade. And and then she was
Those
like,
bastards, who would do something like that?
Someone said, now that this didn't come true, will you agree not to post? This woman is, a prestigious prestigious person at a prestigious think tank. I think at the Eurasia Center is a part of the Atlantic Council. Anyway, she came out and she goes, well, I don't know. Maybe I got it wrong, but I think it'll happen. Watch out for the 20th. She goes, Putin doesn't keep me up to date on everything. Has he called you? This is just some guy on Twitter, by the way.
Let's be fair.
Yeah.
They've drafted those plans.
Yeah, of course they have an array of options, and if they feel like they have to invade and they have no other choice. I mean, this is red line.
The intelligence might be real. The question is, just because they talked about doing it, does that mean that the odds of them actually doing it are that high? That's what we're really talking about.
Right. I think it all depends on the actions of the essentially on the forces, the pro-Kiev forces, and what the Americans and NATO do. Right. Primarily the Americans. But the Americans, by the way, I mean, one of my big pet peeves is that a lot of people are opposing this in America from the standpoint of, why should our boys die for Ukraine and we don't want to send our troops to, but no one's talking about that. That's not on the table at all. Biden's not, I mean, they have ruled that out. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I think Ukraine is starting to say, hey, okay, well, I'd rather make this crisis go away, because they're using us as clearly a chess piece at this point. Like at first, and they've been losing, the head of Zelensky's party came out and said, I forget his last name, but anyway, he came out and said, you can look this up. You just Google, what was the quote? He basically said that we're losing $2 to $3 billion a month because of America's hybrid war. And he goes in there, look at what is being put in Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal and the Sun. He goes, this is worse than, and he names a couple of Russian outlets. And he goes,
all sponsored by Lockheed.
Yeah, he goes, we should, like Politico. He goes, we should study this. He said 2 to 3 weeks from now, when this phase has passed, he says, because this is the elements of hybrid war. And, the Ukrainian foreign minister since last month has been coming out and saying they don't have the forces for an attack right now. They just don't. They don't have the. They don't have the strike forces close enough to Ukraine or Ukrainian cities to do this attack. And the defense minister just came out, I believe, this weekend and said an invasion is not likely anytime soon. So they're starting to turn, because their economy, until recently, as Dr. O has pointed out, and Kyle Anzalone, my buddy and my partner on Conflicts of Interest and Libertarian Institute, he said they both have pointed out that money has been going into the Russian stock market. The stock market has been up, so that doesn't indicate that they think a war is coming anytime soon, and that even money has been going back into Ukraine since they started downplaying the American rhetoric. So I think there's a big, I mean, both of the Russia and Ukraine don't want this to happen, but that doesn't mean that these.
Here's another one.
I think an attack on a major attack on the Donbass that where they start killing ethnic Russians in major numbers, and the clandestine forces and the Russian separatists their militias can no longer like fend it off. That would pose a major threat to Russia's security. And but like I said, I mean, and at that point, it becomes a major proxy war, which is exactly what the worst American hawks want. Because it would give a whole new breath, a whole new life for NATO, which at this point seems to be falling apart. And also, it's going to be a big challenge to see if the EU will go along with the Americans and launch these sanctions, or if they'll stake out a more independent position led by the French and the Germans. It could be a real gut check moment. I mean, obviously, the British seem to be playing along with everything the Americans are doing here. And I think Stoltenberg is just a hawk, and you know, he's one of the worst ones here. But there are real divisions in NATO and in the EU in terms of how to deal with this.
But I mean, if I don't know if you guys are NATO fans or not, but wouldn't that be the best possible outcome?
Yeah, of course.
Turns into nothing.
I hope McGregor's right. I hope it's the end.
The U.S. loses credibility. We can't pull these shenanigans again.
Yeah,
and NATO is seen as a farce because all the peace talks get negotiated by third-party interactions between France and Ukraine and Germany and Russia, and the U.S. is just cut out.
Right.
Hey, Freeman, have you looked at the NATO website before? I love it. It's great.
I think a couple of times. Yeah, let's see.
It's
what
amazing.
Do we got?
What I love about it is just how vague it is about what it really is. I love it. Like, because, you know, as you mentioned, as we've talked about, it was an organization put together for the sole purpose of defending Europe from the Red Menace, from, you know, the Soviet Union,
which doesn't exist
target
anymore.
specifically for them. And it doesn't exist anymore, but NATO's still around. So I wondered, like, well, what does NATO say about themselves? Like what they do. It's great. Okay, so what is NATO? Most important players in the North Atlantic Treaty Organizations are the members. Yeah,
Montenegro is very important to the alliance.
Yeah. Okay, here we go. A political and military alliance. Security in our daily lives is key to our well-being. NATO's purpose is to guarantee the freedom and security of its members through political and military means. Promotes democratic values and enables members to consult and cooperate on defense security-related issues to solve problems, build trust, and in the long run, prevent conflict.
Right.
Diplomatic. Yeah. So, okay. So, yeah. So they're just selling it as like it's like an insurance policy.
Peacekeeping organization.
Yeah.
That launched wars in
It's basically states.
Eastern Europe, Africa, Central Asia.
This just state. Like these people think, okay, well, the states aren't fighting because they're in this big defensive organization. So world peace is just making all the other countries a state, and then magic, nobody fights again.
Yeah, and there was even conjecture about bringing Russia into NATO back in the 90s, and then that all got scuttled. That's the other thing too, is that the Russians,
NATO, though, if you got Russia in there, then
they got like their favorite puppet in there. I think Karl Gershman, the former head of the NED, actually threatened Russia with a regime change around the time of the Ukraine coup. He said something like, "Yeah, well, if you don't like it, if Putin doesn't like it, he may find himself on the other end of one of these revolutions."
Dude, look, I looked up Russia. Like, it doesn't mention Russia at all so far. Like, it hasn't even said that. Like the word Russia.
Control F USSR.
Well, let's see. Let's see what else we can find. Basic points. What else do we got here? A nice little graphic. Some key events. Yeah, I bet you they don't cover the "niet means niet" part of the history. They probably don't cover that.
Doubt it. Europe reunited.
Dude, this is like one of those. What were the things that we all had as a kid, where you put the thing? I don't know.
Kaleidoscope?
Yeah, no, not a kaleidoscope. The thing where you put the disc in there and you push the lever and the.
Oh
yeah, you get the different pictures of like nature and stuff.
Yeah, that's what this looks like to me.
Yeah,
the original slideshow.
And then we're blowing people up. All right,
Yeah, and
anyway.
then they put out their report 2030, NATO Vision 2030, something like that, where they identified China as the new major threat to the North Atlantic.
Oh yeah,
And
so
so-
grow it
so-
until you're at China's border.
Yeah, so I mean, and they've talked about wanting to build up relations, especially with the countries, some of the Quad countries, like India, for instance, and it's yeah, it's not looking good. But honestly, I think that this could really be. We might be seeing best case scenario where, I mean, if you see the end of NATO and the fact that everybody comes to the conclusion that, like, yeah, they can't fight a war in Europe, they can't defend the Europeans the way they said they could, and that all these countries have a free ride, and they back down, and Russia doesn't invade, and the French and the Germans and hopefully cooler heads in Kiev and all these parties can work out something approaching what Minsk was intended to do. It's going to throw, and this new alliance between, or this new partnership with Russia and China, because now if they really try to push it in China, it's always going to be lurking around that, like, Putin is there if he needs him. I mean, that's a big part of why I think these talks in December were so different than the ones last summer, because now they know that Xi Jinping and China are, at least for the moment, behind Russia, and they're much closer than they previously Americans understood. And it's like, what are you going to do? Are you going to fight them both at the same time? So that's why you get a lot of.
I think that's why NATO's. I think that's why I hate to disagree, like, but I don't think NATO's going anywhere. I mean, as long the propaganda is all for the party members.
Right.
So if all the NATO countries, at least most of them, if all the European countries are eating this bullshit, and as long as the defense contractors are getting paid, and great, we have a new enemy now, China. This game's just going to keep going. Hopefully, the fact that the people at the top don't want the war to happen, now it's just we need everyone to think it is going to at any given time, so that we can keep getting paid. We can keep paying the defense contractors. We can keep passing
Justify
the
our
bills.
existence.
Yeah, so I don't think NATO's going anywhere.
Unfortunately, I think you're probably
Yeah.
right. I mean, God, it's a multi-trillion-dollar racket. So
if we don't end up getting in war, because I've noticed this weird pattern. I don't know if you've noticed this too, but North Korea was the first time that we saw this happen, where this was the Trump foreign policy in a nutshell, which was ramp up tensions as high as you can, making just about everybody in the media and everybody think the war's about to happen, so that you can last minute surprise everybody, and it's actually now it's peace, and it's thanks to me, and so we can shake hands and look at the great diplomat I am. Everyone got paid, the media got their red meat, all the war hawks got to get excited for just a moment, and then peace was averted. And then they turn around, they did the same thing almost in Iran, except in that one they actually killed like a head general or whatever, and they didn't have the pomp and circumstance that North Korea had, but it was a similar one of those ramp up tensions, make everyone think a war is about to break out, and then last minute save the day. And it looks like that's what just happened in Ukraine too.
Sounds
right?
like a good
Yeah,
midterm
some hawks
a good what? A good what?
A good midterm story.
Midterm story.
Yeah, well, you know what? That's probably true. I mean, to a large extent, there's, the Biden has a horrible track record at this point. It looks like if you were to judge him off of 2021, there's no way he's going to get reelected, and they're not running Kamala Harris. I would love to know at what point in the first few months of that administration that they realized, oh God, she sucks.
She's terrible.
It's just not going to work. No one wants her.
They have to keep her
tried
down
so hard in the beginning. They were like, come on. Like I always feel like, I feel like she would like to be like, the idea of like Hillary Clinton is like inspiring to her, but she just doesn't have the talent or even the Hillary's not a personable person either. Like she's awful, but Hillary has that drive to power that like will overcome all these other obstacles that might be in her way to get what she wants. And like, for the most part, obviously not the presidency, but Kamala it doesn't work on any level.
I'm not even going to pretend to understand her.
She sunk to the bottom of the Democratic primaries for a reason. They had to prop her up.
Yeah.
No one liked her.
It's hilarious. And so, yeah, I think the Republicans are probably, it looks like they have a real good shot here at the primary, in the midterms and in the next election. And so I think
she actually managed to make Mike Pence look like a likable guy.
Yeah, which is like,
Anyway, I'm sorry to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, right. You're right. I remember that the debate was, God, that was awful. But yeah, I mean, it's tough. Of course, it's a distraction. And also, actually, there was this great article at Responsible Statecraft a little while ago. Some other people, I'm sure, wrote about it. The one I read was at Responsible Statecraft about these quarterly earnings calls of military industrial complex firms like Lockheed and Raytheon. And I think it might have been the Raytheon CEO who was saying, hey, this is great for us. These escalations with Ukraine and Russia and the US. He goes, what did he say? He said, as particularly the stuff going on with the Houthis, their retaliatory strikes on, he just said their attacks on oil facilities in the UAE. And he also said, I think what's going on in the South China Sea, goes, we're going to see a lot of benefit from this. This is great. So
they're saying it. I mean,
yeah. So they're making their money, and Biden. I mean, I don't know how much there's been some encouraging polling coming out that Americans definitely don't want to have their boys die for Ukraine. And I think a lot of them think that when you say economic measures or whatever, they don't really understand that we're talking about a virtual siege on Russia, or at least that's the attempt.
Can you tell?
They don't want military action. What I think should be really asked, though, is like, do you want a proxy war with the? By the way, the Nazi thing I think is becoming more commonly understood. And I will say this, that I think it just needs to be put to the American people, like, they're getting ready for a proxy war and this economic war concurrently. Do you support that? Because we're not talking about American troops dying. No one's saying that. So what we need to do is say no to this. Because I'll tell you, it's weird. Remember when we said no to war in Syria in 2013? The American people said no. And Obama wanted like an Iraq War II style invasion to overthrow Damascus. It didn't happen. But they launched the covert war. They launched Timber Sycamore.
They
and
still wanted to do it. Yeah.
500,000 people.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like, I mean, I'm sure they did in so many ways, but that Yahoo piece and those New York Times pieces that came out were really high profile. What they were going, hey, this is the plan. We've been preparing for it for 7 years, and this is exactly what we're going to do. And we're threatening the Russians about it all the time.
I think the Nazi part of this story is probably my favorite part. Just obviously I love Nazis. First of all, I love Nazis. But so the funny thing is, we've been spending all this time looking for Nazis and accusing people that they're Nazis when they never said they were. And even if they deny it, like, they're actually, they align with Nazis. They just don't realize it. So we're looking for Nazis under the bed at night. And then finally, for the first time in my life, there's actual Nazis part of the story, and they're on our side. Yeah. And the American liberals are on their side too, and they just don't know it.
We had even
the people who were so scared of the Nazis before. There were even
Chechen brothers of the Islamic State traveling from Syria to Ukraine to fight ethnic Russians in the East during the war with, alongside the Nazis against these Russians. And Branko Marchteach has described, he was just on the Scott Horton show. He wrote a piece about the Nazi element in Ukraine and U.S. support and all this. And he's saying that it's turned into like Mecca for the global far right. They travel, and Americans, Kyle's report on this at Conflicts of Interest, you have Americans traveling to Ukraine to fight Russians because it's Adam Waffen, I believe. There's been evidence of these guys going there and coming back. Kyle reported on some guy who did that and came back and robbed a house and met some resistance and killed 2 people. So, I mean, there's already blowback happening from this. And like, if they really want to do, so it's weird to me because it's like, imagine if in Syria they had said publicly, like again and again, like Sullivan is saying, it'll be really bad for Ukraine if Russia invades and this war gets started. He goes, but it'll also come at a huge strategic cost. He might have even said it'll be a strategic victory for us because Russia will bleed so bad, or something. He didn't say bleed so bad, but he said like it would be a strategic victory. Like, it wouldn't be the worst thing if this happened, because imagine the damage it could do to Russia. And so
they're not even like almost Nazis. Like, these are actually like unapologetically Sieg-heiling Nazis.
The 8th Battalion, yep.
And they're on our side.
This is Obama's. That's the craziest thing about it too. Like, this is Obama's coup. And then Trump was so proud because of Russiagate. And I don't like to just I'm not taking the blame away from him. I'm just saying that helped motivate him. He has the famous quote. I think it's in a CNN interview or something, but it's like, hey, Obama sent them pillows. I sent them missiles.
Tank busters or whatever.
They're built by Raytheon partly. And obviously our defense chief is a former board member. So
Unbelievable. Okay, so there's one thing I still don't really understand. What are the people in the Donbass region? What are they doing that is causing the reaction of the U.S. sending their people to go crack their skulls in?
well, they refuse to let Kiev consolidate their power over the country, and
But by what? By what?
oh, well, they've occupied government buildings and they're refusing to
Okay,
let.
okay.
Yeah, I mean
So riots and stuff.
Oh well, I mean
throwing out people.
they've essentially seized territory, and there was this major war, but it was theirs, So there's an illegal coup where they flipped the government, but these people said we elected our guy, and that's not democracy, and they also saw it as an existential threat. So it was in many ways defensive, and then and obviously you can't defend it, but in that case, I mean it is defensive. And then the Russians coming in, they didn't take the territory, but you've got a lot of Russian citizens at stake there, so they sent in, like I said, these deniable sort of special operations forces to help support them. And but that's it. They won't accept the takeover.
Okay.
That's the craziest thing. I mean, the whole idea when they say that territory, they're talking about making those people submit. That's what territorial integrity and sovereignty means to NATO and to these American hawks and British hawks. And
Ukraine should just sell that part of the country to Russia. Just sell it. Shake hands.
Well, that's the thing.
Now you don't have to invade. You don't have to.
They said it would break the country. One of they're like national security. I forget. He's sort of the analogous to a national security advisor. Said that would break the country, and the West should not force us to implement Minsk II, because that will it'll cause basically like chaos, because the West would never accept that. And it was weird because
they
want
it to him, then Putin will buy Europe. That's going to be the scare story. What if he buys all of Europe?
Exactly. But they should. But again, if you keep that Donbass as a part of Ukraine, which would be the idea, be still a part of Ukraine, but it would have this regional autonomy and this ceasefire, and there would be changes to the constitution. But if he doesn't necessarily want it for the mere political fact, or one reason would be because they can oppose NATO membership if it comes to that, So
right.
So it would be. But again, I don't think they have the numbers right now for support there. In fact, most people in Ukraine, I think, from what I've read the surveys, that most people don't even support allying with Russia. They support neutrality, which is really the only real solution here.
Yeah.
You got to has to just be neutral. They can't, this promise in 2008 to Georgia and Ukraine, they already whispered in Saakashvili's ear, Cheney's aides, and he started a war and thought the U.S. would come and back him up. And when they didn't, because the Russians were already security forces in South Ossetia as part of an EU brokered deal, they were attacked by Georgia, and then they responded and beat his forces back. And Cheney was telling Bush, there's a article by Andrew Coburn about this, and it's in his new book. Cheney was telling Bush to bomb Russians under the Caucasus Mountains and just start killing Russians. And even, I think it was Condoleezza Rice, and I forget who else. I don't think it was Hadley, but maybe, who was interfacing between Bush and Cheney to keep someone near Bush telling him in his ear, don't do this. No. Because they were worried that Bush would just be like, oh, Dick's yelling at me again. I've got to, So, but thankfully he didn't listen to him. But there's this idea. I mean, Trump actually bombed Russian mercenaries in Syria in 2018 and February 6th, I think, in Deir ez-Zor province. And the U.S. coalition there with the Kurds actually bombed Russian mercenaries, not Russian troops, but Russian mercenaries.
That was the exact thing that I was worried about with that whole thing. It would be an accident like that, and then someone overreacting somewhere, and then next thing you know, there's a full scale world war out of it.
There were U.S. media reports, I think, and even in Reuters. Anybody can go look this stuff up about, because the numbers that you read about, especially when this story was first reported, they wildly vary. And one of my articles, I cite, I think, the foreign ministry spokeswoman of Russia, who comes out and says, actually, I think like 5 of the mercenaries were killed, but she said they were bombed and killed by these American-backed forces and these American forces. But there were like U.S. military officials and in the media going like, yeah, we killed hundreds of them. It's wild. It's you can, I mean, they
Whoa.
killed and injured hundreds of them, and they were like boasting about it. There's a lot of, it's very dangerous. All this constant, like, you know, where they get intercepted here and there in Syria or in the Black Sea. I mean, we're really like taking chances, and a lot of these guys,
Because we're America.
just want to fight. Yeah. There've been close calls too with the ground forces there, with the Russians and the Americans in Syria.
Fucking
With
craziness.
yeah. But that's unfortunately that's what Putin, I get, you know, Syria is a kind of a micro, and Ukraine is kind of a microcosm of all this. It's, you know,
Both pretty close to each other, by the way.
yeah, saying no to all this. Yeah. Especially, and like, it's just, they're not accepting this unipolar moment stuff anymore. I mean, that's what seizing Crimea and intervening in the Syrian civil war, the U.S. dirty war there, and stopping Al Qaeda or ISIS from taking Damascus and saying, you're not doing another Iraq.
Calling their bluff. Yeah.
Yeah. That it's changed the game. So it's a multipolar world, but the Americans won't give up hegemony. That's the real risk.
Yeah.
But again, I agree with you that I don't think, I think that I always expect the worst, but lately I'm hoping for the best. I wouldn't hope for anything, and I used to only expect the worst, but I do hope that this situation really does
fizzle out.
It's still good news.
It's
still good news. It's still good news because it does expose NATO as kind of a paper tiger.
Yeah, yeah.
And so
No doubt.
even though NATO's not going to go away, it's you know, if NATO and Russia
treaty in
can
name
talk,
only.
if Russia and NATO can talk their way out of this conflict, it just kind of shows that maybe there's people on top who don't want this to happen, and that's the only thing that's keeping this whole thing from just blowing up. And
if they restore the INF treaty, that would also be a major step forward, saying that, like, yeah, we don't have to just accept this. But again, I wonder about Congress, because they're against. I don't know. We'll have to see if that actually comes up. Maybe they can organize something where it's not like a treaty necessarily. I don't know. I think they should go for that, but they may find a new way to just sort of revise something that's analogous to it. But if you look at the hawkish protests against returning to the JCPOA, it's very discouraging. And the fact that the Democrats, like the whole squad, like, I would just like to see some people talking about, like, they should be really mad at Trump for leaving these arms treaties and escalating this crisis, and and let alone everything Bush and Obama did. I'm just saying, like, that there's just no real push. It doesn't seem to reel any of this in.
Right.
I will say this: I was surprised to see. I heard Scott say on the show recently that AOC came out and said something about how this crisis with Ukraine is largely manufactured by the military-industrial complex, and she goes, after Afghanistan, they're starved of revenue, so they're trying to start a whole new crisis to justify more money going to the Pentagon. And then Bernie Sanders tweeted out yesterday or Thursday. Friday, he comes out. I don't know if you guys saw this. He goes, I'm paraphrasing. He's like, it's baffling that in the age of COVID and climate change, that a world leader would think to start a war and kill thousands and create millions of refugees. He goes, but unfortunately, that's exactly what Vladimir Putin is doing, and he seems to be refusing any diplomacy to resolve the crisis. And so I honestly think that someone might have tapped him on the shoulder and said, dude, you need to get, like, your faction in line and set an example, because I hate AOC and have the lowest of expectations, but I was impressed with that line. I'm never surprised by Bernie being a piece of shit. Yeah. So.
Well, let me ask you this. Can you put together a coherent, like, this is the mainstream narrative on why American progressives need to care about the Ukrainians? Because I don't even know. I don't think I've even heard anybody.
Have you ever seen people? I mean, people literally have this kind of they hate us because we're free version of it, where they go, Putin. To be honest with you, I don't read or watch enough mainstream news, I don't think, to really do it. But I'll I think the idea is, I think the Republicans generally play to weakness, Biden's
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
fecklessness,
easy.
appeasement, all this shit.
That's
And then
easy.
the Democrats, I think it's about democracy, and they have to literally lie their asses off to get Democrats to support real Nazis.
I actually
So
heard.
it's like, it's
Yeah,
crazy. So they have to say something. It's usually about, this is about democracy,
I heard
and
one sort of.
sovereignty, human rights, the usual crap. That's what Blinken is talking about.
I
They
heard one
actually have
third-
said you can't say who can associate, what countries can associate with other countries, and you can't, reorganize borders of different
Right.
countries. Nobody does that.
Does Ukraine have their own sovereignty to choose which organization they're a part of? I heard secondhand somebody, like the actual mainstream narrative argument, which was essentially, the Ukrainians are a democracy and they
Right.
deserve sovereignty, and if
Yes.
they don't want to be bullied by Russia and join NATO, they should be allowed to do so. That's why we're sticking up for Ukraine.
Right. And that's the funny thing about that is they don't have a right to do that, because it's up to the NATO member states. The NATO charter says clearly, like, first of all, they go, it has to be furthering the security of the alliance in the North Atlantic and, all this. And then they say that it can't be like there can't be like ongoing border disputes and conflagrations in the midst. You can't just bring a country that's already at war into NATO. So, and you also have to have all 30 member states okay it and support it, which is not going to happen. So Ukraine's decision, like, Ukraine could drop their bid to want to join NATO, but they can't just be like, hey, me and Antony Blinken and Victoria Nuland really think it's a great idea, and but so does Biden, so we're in, right? Like, or the British are cool with it, so they can't do that.
Yeah.
And then the Americans don't have to accept it. I love when they say, "We will never close the door on," but you could close the door, and that would resolve a lot of these problems. I think the Russians are. I think the Russians have some of these demands that they know are not. I shouldn't say that. They know that those ones are a little bit less reachable than the missile placement and the arms control stuff, because I think the Americans seem to be most receptive to that. But the stuff about closing the door on NATO, I think they would really like. They mean that, but also I think they know it's unlikely. I think even with the NATO proposal, the response to their security proposal, they were like, oh God, Lavrov said, I feel sorry for the people that had to write this. He goes, it's full of NATO's pride and all this stuff. So
Yeah,
I
they're treating Ukraine's right to join NATO as like gay people have a right to get married. They're treating it along
Yeah.
the same lines of,
Yeah.
what? How could you say they don't have a right to marry someone they love? Like, okay,
Right.
yeah, you're
this
right.
is geopolitics, idiot. Like, this isn't LGBTQ shit. It's
Yeah,
NATO. It's only 4 letters.
I think that everybody needs to understand. I think that it's just, I don't know. But the progressives thing, I don't, you can't possibly support this posture if you're concerned about Ukrainians. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
they
is it
support a
smart to join
policy-
NATO? That's the question.
No, and that can't happen. So if you keep pushing it like this and keep throwing in, they're at this point the third highest recipient of U.S. military aid, or they're very close to being there.
Oh,
I mean,
wow.
it's
I didn't
$2.7
realize
billion.
Third? Holy shit.
Yeah, hundreds of millions. What is it? The defending Ukraine, that bill I mentioned from Menendez also would tack on an additional $500 million in military aid. And I think at the end of last year, they did like $200 and $300 million aid deliveries on top of each other. They okayed the Baltic states to just start sending them Stinger missiles, which echoes the whole Afghanistan dirty war in the 80s. So they and the British, were sending in all kinds of more Javelin anti-tank missiles. That bill that Menendez has talks about we need to send them anti-ship weapons, anti-armor weapons, anti-aircraft weapons, anti-tank weapons, grenade. We already are sending
anti-tank weapons.
Yeah, exactly. Cover all bases. But like that's where the worst sort of. I mean, they're providing them the weapons to launch that offensive on the east and to finally take the country. They can't fight a war. They'll lose to Russia. I mean, it would be a bloody, horrible war but it would, it might even be as bad as like Iraq or Afghanistan or something, but that's why the Russians don't want to do it. So, but the most risky thing is that those most hardline factions and the Americans start this proxy war. And I don't think progressives, maybe not even most people on the right, get that, because it's like, I think some people think of it as like a victory if our boys don't die. But in the meantime, we're losing billions of dollars, and it's only going to drive up. It's going to cause an energy crisis. Even Biden said that.
Terrorism.
These sanctions, these sanctions on America, these sanctions on Russia, if this all pops off, it's going to hurt the American people. It's going to, drive up gas prices and all kinds of stuff. So, and with everything going on in our economy, this is absolutely insane. So there's no reason for the progressives to support it, but I always feel like they find new ways to get both sides and the new iterations of each side to kind of have a new way to support the status quo. It's very clever the way they do that.
And it always centers around like sticking up for the little guy who's being picked on. They all have kind of the same thing. They're appealing to Americans' like sense of being a good person, like these moral, altruistic assholes. Like in America, we're so great. If we're good Americans and we care about the downtrodden, we have to care about the Ukrainians. Throw a dart. It's like throwing a dart at the map. Like, we're going to feel sorry for the Ukrainians. Meanwhile, they've never heard of Yemen or what's going on there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Literal genocide. And they go, and honestly, if you talk about like, the intent of the ultra nationalists is to carry out a massive ethnic cleansing campaign and just murder these Russians. And they're very highly motivated and organized to do so. And if this really kicks off, that would be one of the things that these Nazis would be carrying out. And Blinken at the Security Council goes, and Russia's going to lie and say that they're going to carry out ethnic cleansing or a genocide. And he goes, and that offends me with my family history. Imagine the hypocrisy. Just the God. So,
offended.
And Afghanistan, the thing is, same kind of people that support all these bills to sanction Russia and to keep the economic war going against Iran, and hurt all these people with cancer and all these other problems, continuing the economic crisis in Iran, the maximum pressure campaign. These same kind of people, Li Fang from The Intercept was in the Senate offices and was looking for an answer on the before Biden came out and said, I'm going to split it and give half of the frozen assets that we stole to 9/11 families and half of it in these aid programs, which, like I said, is not going to really solve the crisis. And so, but they go, this is before all that, where it was just, they're frozen and fuck it. And there was basically the World Food Program had come out and said that 22 million people are on the verge of starvation in this winter, and 8 million are about nearly at famine. And Li Fang this reporter goes there and he starts asking these senators, they're all walking around outside and inside the halls, and he's asking them, can I talk to you about the sanctions on the Taliban and the frozen assets? And most of them just walk right by, or they flip their hand like fuck off, or they say, hey, I'm not rewarding the Taliban. He goes, what about the these starving children and women and all this stuff? And he goes, they all basically said like, well, we want to help them, but we're not going to reward the Taliban. And that basically they didn't offer any solution. It's just the same. These people are totally content to kill those same people they wanted you to be so, afraid of coming to death at the hands of the Taliban. They're happy to starve them all to death. Potentially 1 million people or more if this kind of keeps going the way it is. And yeah, it's an incredible video. I don't remember all the quotes, but there were senators who were literally like flipping their hands and going like just dismissing these questions. It's disgusting. So they're not, they don't give a shit about humanitarian concerns and sovereignty.
Well, the way I put it is the media has they've trained them to care, and I really think they do care. That's the weird thing when you talk about these people, like when they talk about how much they really care about, like, say, the kids in cages, right? Like, I really believe them that they care, but I don't believe they would care if the media didn't make them care.
That's right.
That's the important thing. And it doesn't really sink in that it's like the kids are still in the cages right now. They just stopped caring about them because the media move them on to something else, and they
Yeah.
want them to care about Ukrainians now, and that's what they care about.
It's
So
very
weird. What do
it's
you do
very,
about that? Because I can't tell them you don't actually care about it, but also
Ah.
they definitely wouldn't want to hear what I just said, which is you only care because the media is making you care. They definitely wouldn't want to hear that.
Also, there's never that much analysis of why there's all these refugees. It's because of U.S. foreign policy, and then also I think there's a deep American exceptionalism and a bias toward. I mean, my point about this used to be that they only care about those people if they can get close enough to Americans that we can see them. And if a CNN camera is there now, in the situation like Ukraine or when they're trying to keep you in Afghanistan or something like that, then yeah, they'll film these people and they'll say, how dare we leave our allies behind? And
Right.
that the Hawks will talk about this is going to damage our credibility and our hegemony and all this kind of thing. But
they turn the cameras off whenever the offensive is going on and the U.S. is winning, and then they turn them on when it's going badly, I guess, to shame the people who are ruining their project, right?
Well, yeah, I mean they a lot of the people who try to pump themselves up is like, we're on the right, like we're anti-interventionists and why are we in Syria? And they'll just say it like that, and then they don't really come back to what their solution is to end the occupation or the Caesar Act sanctions, which have 60% of the population, like over 12 million people at the brink of starvation and 80% of the country living in poverty. And we have sanctioned their construction and engineering sector. So the explicit position of the Secretary of State, the Biden administration, is we are absolute, and Brett McGurk, the National Security Coordinator, is two things. They're 100% against normalization with other regional countries, including Arab countries that have begun to attempt to do that with Assad because they know he's not going anywhere. And they're absolutely against Syria's reconstruction after the war until there is a political settlement that America is satisfied with, which essentially means regime change. And in the meantime, Israel bombs Syria virtually every week. And I've never seen, outside of maybe somebody who's written a column that ends up at antiwar.com, I've never seen a right winger or a Republican talk about that. I know people like Dan Larison will, but I don't see a lot of these like sort of new right, like Joe Kent's and Blake Masters and these kinds of people. I never see, or even any of those people. Bannon, I don't know if Tucker's ever talked about Israel bombing Syria every week. It's very sad. I mean, because again, to your point, everybody got okay. So the Democrats were like, he's president now. When Trump bombed Syria in April of 2017 and 2018,
then suddenly it was a big problem.
And everybody goes, the right, they opposed that, and they go, the right is so much better on war now. They're anti-interventionist. I think it's kind of a crock. I would wish that was true, and I think in some elements, I think in some cases that is true, but by and large, I think they're all still very bad on Russia, China, and all these different things. And even if they're good on Russia, they're bad on China.
Yeah, unfortunately, Afghanistan, they showed that they just flipped right back once Trump was gone.
Because it was weakness.
China-phobia is crazy.
Well, even Josh Hawley was coming out and saying this stuff about. I'll tell you what, man. Joe Kent is he's this guy who's he's running for Congress, I think, in Washington, and he comes out and he's talking about how he's supposed to be this anti-interventionist guy. I'm in special forces, or I was, and my wife died in Syria, and Trump tried to pull out, and then the Democrats in the deep state stopped him, and so I'm against war. Well, so if you look at his platform on his website, it's all about strengthening NATO, stopping Nord Stream 2, cutting off Europe from Russian gas, building up a coalition of alliances against of nations and alliances against China, holding them accountable for their genocide, and piling on sanctions on China, and supporting the Abraham Accords, which were a historic achievement, of Trump, and peace in the Middle East. So, I mean, they are very adept, and I'm not saying it's like a majorly coordinated thing. I know the guy's backed by Peter Thiel, and I find people like Blake Masters to also be very suspicious, and like all of them talk about like decoupling from China, even if they're not explicit about it. Joe Kent is the most explicit. He says it needs to be our number one national security priority is decoupling with China, and then they don't really address, or I'm I'm waiting to find more information on what he feels about the Asia pivot and Biden's massive buildup against China, because I was looking at a thing. He was doing a talk tonight about China, and I was listening to it for briefly, and they go, "We've turned our back on the Black Sea." And like they were complaining about this, and like I just said, we had our Navy there for 182 days, and 2021 is largely what started this whole crisis. And it's very bizarre. They kind of take this term America first, but then they suck all the actual possible good things that could have, if Trump had been stronger. Trump's whole thing, his opposition, I think he was ultimately bad on NATO, but he questioned the purpose of it, which is a major step forward. But these guys, they just say America first, and they go, we need to strengthen NATO, and we need to cut off, like I said, Russian gas from going to Europe. And then they go, but the member states need to pay their fair share. And Josh Hawley was going, what did he say? We need to drop this demand for Ukraine. We should end our support for Ukraine joining NATO. Not necessary, and we don't need to be involved in this. And he goes, I wouldn't be opposed to it. I'd be down for it if NATO member states were spending more money on their defense. And a lot of this, again, is buying American weapons.
Free money, yeah.
Yeah, or we pay for it and send it the other way. So, I mean, Jesus Christ. And then what was his thing? He says, because our main thing is we need to build up in the Indo-Pacific to counter and contain China. And prepare for some inevitable big naval battle in the South. So
Taiwan is going to be Ukraine Part 2. I mean, but that's a whole nother episode.
No, but I think that's largely analogous, because you have I agree, but they you have these they're essentially U.S. military outposts right on the border. And Ukraine, Taiwan is, China considers it its territory, and a lot of other countries do too. So we have U.S. and now they're boasting about it. We have U.S. troops in Taiwan. So I mean, it's very similar to Ukraine, where you have U.S. At least in a case of Ukraine, it's special forces and these CI paramilitaries. Who knows the full extent of what's been going on in Taiwan, but we've been sending troops there for decades to train, and sending weapons to them for decades. It's escalated, and especially since Trump. But now they're Tsai Ing-wen, the president, whose successor will likely be even worse than her. Her vice president's even more hawkish in the Democratic Progressive Party. They're very pro-separatist. It's going to get a lot worse, because they're getting closer and closer to declaring independence, and they're emboldened by the U.S. support. And now they're open about it. They're like, hey, yeah, we do have U.S. troops down here. Like, what? And they're preparing them for a fucking war with the mainland. Everybody knows it. Like, that's the stated purpose, is like, and then we sail our warships to the Taiwan Strait constantly. But Biden, like I said, 2,000 sorties last year. Just by November, it was like 80 something in November alone. And
the U.S. will
they send a warship to the Taiwan Strait every month. You got Canadians doing the same thing now, and
I guess
French and the Germans and the English sailing warships in the South China Sea.
My own ignorance, I thought Taiwan had already declared their own independence, but I guess it's always been this, walking on eggshell dance that everyone's doing.
They're going to join Canada to surprise everybody.
There you go. It's strategic ambiguity, and they've got that dual deterrence strategy, but. Obama kind of there's a great article by Gareth Porter about this. He focuses on this one. Basically, Tsai Ing-wen in the past, they would have not let somebody like that come to power because it's too risky. Like, you're too hawkish and way too pro independence, and explicitly so. So now they haven't formally said we're independent from China and this guy that, but they talk about in the dialogue is getting closer and closer to that.
Right.
The rhetoric and the military buildups, and they're spending more and more on their military and developing their own submarine fleet, and you've got all these attack submarines moving into the region, to Australia, which is that the whole point of that is to do what these patrols and basically they're circling China, and the whole idea is the Australians will say this is we expect to be at war with China over Taiwan in very short time, in maybe a decade, and I've heard worse estimates than that.
I need to go. I need to go whenever they open back up. I need to do a trip to Taiwan, see the country before it becomes absorbed into the CCP.
Before it becomes illegal for you to go there.
Yeah.
Author of Flags of Our Fathers said to, and again, I think Taiwan is another situation like Ukraine, where I think China would vastly prefer a peaceful solution to that, peaceful reunification. If you read Peter Van Buren, he's very.
There's a lot of important economic infrastructure there. They don't want to blow up.
It'd be way better for them to be a puppet state than for
Like
them to
something
be
like
part of the
a
state.
vast majority of all the microprocessors in the world are made in Taiwan. And a hot war on that that island would not be good for the world.
No, and they have, they have all kinds of, the numbers are insane. The amount of trade that goes on and the travel that goes on between China and Taiwan. I mean, those are their kin. They don't really have the military capability unless they wanted to just like wipe the thing off the face of the earth.
Taiwan's more Chinese than the Chinese are. The CCP purged all the culture out, and all the culture went to Taiwan.
But they've drafted the plans, so get ready for the news to drop. Like, okay, China has plans to invade Taiwan. We found
Taiwan has plans.
That's right. Yeah, that's a false flag. They're going to do a false flag with a video. Oh my god!
All right, so in 2023, we're going to have the same episode for Taiwan whenever Ukraine's going to be a false. Down.
Well, by then
it'll be interesting again because I think that Russia will now be an invisible. Putin will be invisible, but he'll be in the room if there's talks akin to this. The racket might continue, but they might know that like we can't really fight a major war with Russia or China. It's still a great boogeyman, I guess. And that's really the main thing is like you got to just the scary thing to me especially is this drive toward decoupling. Because it's analogous to the Democrats' push to cut off Russia from the world from the West and the world economy. I mean,
that's true. That is a good point. Yeah. Meanwhile, the rest of the market as a whole suffers. So the defense contractors make a shitload of money, but meanwhile, a lot of industries are hurt because of this kind of like reckless posturing to, get a good deal.
There's just a report coming out. It's very possible that the 2023 Pentagon budget, the whole defense budget, rather, with including the Department of Energy, nuclear weapons money, it could be over $800 billion next year. So I think the number they said that they were floating just for the Pentagon was $770 billion. And usually there's a couple of 10 billion more on top of that. So
it's hard to argue. Why can't we just make everything free when we spend that kind of money?
I think that's what AOC says a lot, which is interesting. It's not really it's a horrible argument if you know anything about economics, but there is a point, like Bill Hicks was talking about that, about we spend trillions of dollars a year on all this shit. Imagine what we could do if we wanted to like explore space or actually like feed the poor of the world and all this kind of stuff. I mean, I think there's ways you can do that through just, free trade and liberty and a real belief in, property rights and these kinds of things and peace. But that's the point, is the opportunity cost of all this, the military establishment and NATO's a huge part of that. It's kind of, but again, maybe we're getting to a point where people will start to realize, but somehow I believe the Americans will be the last to catch on to all this, that like, it's time to stop.
Yeah. You heard, what was me and Nick's idea? Like, we need to somehow like, give, or I think you were here too when we got this idea, like, let's give them robots and have them go fight other robots somewhere else. So they think they're still saving the world, but really we just got them to go do something else and leave everyone alone. There's
got to be some way.
Yeah.
I wonder, maybe you could even just give the Americans like Russian robots or Chinese robots, and they can just punch it like a heavy bag. It just kind of like get out all their aggression and spend money.
You remember BattleBots from like the 90s?
Oh yeah, the green, the blue and red. We should
just replace the Olympics with international BattleBots. There you go. Everyone just develops their best, fighting androids to kill each other, idea. And no one has to die.
Maybe we could like. I don't know, if you can't get rid of the military industrial complex, maybe just shut them down. And if the American people, they want to give that money or just whatever, just give them the money so they can build all their other houses that they've always wanted. Like,
I'd be okay with bringing back short range nuclear weapons for a battle like that. Just
keep it.
Find some island chain in the Pacific, move the natives off of it, and then have them battle on that.
A nuclear artillery cannon.
Just for sport. All right. Well, I think so. Okay. Well,
Closing
Freeman,
thoughts?
what else? Anything else?
Main thing is, I mean, Zelensky should be, well, Biden is supposed to, like I said, supposed to be talking to Putin again soon. Lavrov is speaking to Blinken on Thursday. Now, there could be some real progress here with the French. I just think that we're starting to see a wind down, but at the same time, the violence in the Donbass is supposedly going back. It's going back and forth. I mean, the Americans are blaming it all on the separatists, but I mean, I don't believe that, and I don't see any reason to. And I don't even think the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe is saying that. So, and they're monitoring all of it. So and the videos are coming out are showing it's not just that. So the biggest risk now is as they're evacuating. There is a reason why they're evacuating hundreds of thousands of people, and Russia's taking them in and giving them money and shelter. That there could be a war being started as we speak, but if it does happen, it'll be the one it'll be the proxy war, I think. But also it'll mean the sanctions. It'll mean everything with Russia, and we go down a much darker path. I assume at that point negotiations would shut off, which is what they're saying. Actually, whenever Jen Psaki came out today, I believe, and confirmed that there is this expectation that Biden and Putin will be talking again soon. And she goes, if there isn't a Russian invasion. Now, again, I don't think that they are going to do that. And I think unless their hand is forced, they won't. But we could be seeing a buildup. Now, there's a lot of conflicting reports about Russia sending more reinforcements into the area as opposed to pulling them back, like they said. Now, that again could be in response to the refugee crisis, or it could be in response to the escalations on the other side. But like I said, we don't know. But there's a major offensive planned economically, diplomatically, and militarily in terms of the CIA involvement there and all the weapon shipments and everything else, and the proxy war that, I mean, they really are just salivating over right now. So that's the main thing to oppose and the main thing to watch out for.
Freeman,
very much.
you haven't skipped a beat, my man, and you're really, really good at name dropping, and I really appreciate that. So you really talk the talk, man.
Your recollection of all the important figures, their names, how to pronounce them, spot on.
I appreciate it. I guess.
So so next time,
always fun being back.
Hopefully we won't talk about Taiwan, but I still want that man bear pig. So you better find us a human hybrid, please. Okay. Well, we will. Thanks for listening. We'll see you guys later.
Peace out, everybody, and thank you guys. Do it again soon.